Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we step behind the camera, beyond the glamour of Goodfellas, beyond Henry Hill's version of events, because there was a man the movie barely showed you. A man who didn't chase spotlight, didn't talk to reporters, didn't flip, didn't brag. Frenchy McMahon, Jimmy Burke's most trusted enforcer, the quiet shadow behind the Lufthansa fallout. The man who may have helped erase anyone who knew too much. In the film, he's a background figure. In reality, he was one of the most dangerous men in the room. But before we disappear into this story, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there right now? It's always incredible to see this underworld grow across countries, time zones, and sleepless nights. And if you appreciate deep, fact-driven Mafia documentaries, the stories that Hollywood only half tells, make sure to subscribe and join the Outlaw Icons family. Because here, we don't just repeat the legend, we uncover the man behind it. Now, take a slow breath, let the noise of the day fade away, and prepare to step into the quietest corner of the Lufthansa story, where loyalty meant silence, and silence meant survival. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The man you barely saw. The body lay in the trunk longer than it should have. The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere in Queens, a dog barked at nothing. Inside the car, the air was heavy with metal and gasoline and something darker. The man standing beside the open trunk did not rush. He never rushed. He closed it with two steady hands and walked away without looking back, as if he had just finished a routine errand. No speeches, no shouting, no theatrics, just silence. Years later, when the movie came out, you would not remember him. You would not even know you were looking at him. There is a moment in Goodfellas, brief as a blink, when Frenchy McMahon passes through the frame. No swelling music, no sharp dialogue, no camera lingering on his face. He stands near the edges of chaos, another body in a room filled with bigger personalities. You are too busy watching the laughter, the cocaine, the swagger. The film belongs to someone else, so you assume he is background muscle, a spare tire, a man who exists to fill space. But that assumption is the first mistake. The story you were told was Henry Hill's story. It was bright and fast and soaked in excess. It showed you the suits, the dinners, the clubs, the rush of being inside something powerful. It showed you fear, too. But it showed you fear from the perspective of a man who talked, a man who needed to be seen, a man who would eventually sit in a courtroom and narrate his own fall like it was a confession and a performance all at once. Frenchy operated in a different lane entirely. If Henry was the salesman, Frenchy was the mechanic in the back room, the one who kept the engine running while everyone else admired the paint job. He did not chase attention because attention was a liability. In that world, attention was like blood in the water. It attracted sharks. The smart men understood that power was not about who spoke the loudest. It was about who could be trusted when things went wrong. And things always went wrong. In the 1960s, when the crew around Jimmy Burke was tightening into something dangerous and disciplined, loyalty was currency. Not the kind you counted with bills and coins, but the kind you measured in silence. The kind that meant you would not fold under pressure. The kind that meant you would do what needed to be done and never mention it again. Frenchy built his reputation there, in the quiet spaces between headlines. Burke valued two traits above all else: reliability and restraint. He did not need men who bragged. He did not need men who drank too much and let stories slip out of their mouths. He needed men who could carry weight without buckling. Men who understood that sometimes the most important work happened after the party ended, when the music stopped and the lights were off. Frenchy was one of those men. In Goodfellas, the camera chases the chaos. It follows the laughter, the fights, the impulsive violence. It gives you the heat of the moment. But real criminal organizations are not sustained by chaos. They're sustained by structure, by men who can be counted on, men who treat illegal work like a craft rather than a thrill. Frenchy was not there for the adrenaline. He was there because it was work. Serious work. You can see it in the way he moves in the background of those scenes. He does not perform. He watches. He listens. His face does not reveal much. In a room full of alpha personalities, he feels almost invisible, and that invisibility is his greatest strength. It is easy to fear the loud man at the table. It is much harder to fear the quiet one who says nothing, but whose opinion still carries weight. There is a difference between a hanger-on and a trusted enforcer. A hanger-on laughs at the boss's jokes and waits to be included. An enforcer is included before the jokes even start. An enforcer knows the stakes of a plan before the first word is spoken. Frenchy was inside that circle long before the Lufthansa money ever hit the headlines. When people think about killers in that era, they picture volatility. They picture men who explode without warning. But volatility is messy. Volatility draws attention. The men who lasted were the ones who understood that violence, in that world, was a tool. A wrench. A hammer. Something you used only when the machine stopped working. Frenchy had that discipline. Burke trusted him not because he was the loudest, but because he was the least likely to crumble. Trust in organized crime is fragile. It is built slowly and destroyed in a second. Every man around that table had something to lose. Pride, money, freedom, life itself. When paranoia crept in, and it always did, Burke leaned on the men who did not panic. Frenchy did not panic. Henry Hill later told stories filled with fear and adrenaline. He remembered the jokes, the insults, the sudden bursts of rage. He remembered the rush. But even he admitted there were parts of the operation he was not fully inside. There were conversations he was not present for. Decisions made without him. Frenchy lived in those spaces. The film never lingers on that reality because it is harder to dramatize. It is harder to show a man who does not speak much, but whose silence is heavy. Yet behind every flashy crime, there are men who ensure the aftermath is handled. The planning, the cleanup, the quiet follow-up that ensures no loose ends remain. Those tasks rarely make it to the screen. In the world Jimmy Burke built, loose ends were like frayed wires. Ignore them long enough, and they spark fires. Fires that brought cops, prosecutors, headlines. The crew's survival depended on preventing those sparks. Frenchy was part of that prevention. To understand who he really was, you have to step away from the spotlight of Goodfellas and into the darker corridor behind it. Imagine the scene after the laughter fades, after the doors close, after the last drink is poured. That is where Frenchy becomes visible, not to the public, not to the press, but to the men who mattered. He was not chasing reputation. He did not need the aura of a legend. Legends attract curiosity. Curiosity leads to investigation. He preferred the opposite, invisibility. It is a strange paradox. The more dangerous a man can be, the less he needs to announce it. Like a deep current beneath a calm river, he moved quietly, but with force. In interviews and testimony, you will not find long monologues about him. You will find mentions, hints, a name that surfaces when trust is discussed, when reliability is described, when someone says, "He was there," without elaborating. That is the pattern. Frenchy was there. The assumption that he was background muscle says more about how we consume crime stories than about who he actually was. We gravitate toward noise, toward personality, toward spectacle. But real power often sits still. It waits. It does not need applause. There is an irony in the way films shape memory. Millions watched Goodfellas and believed they saw the whole picture. They felt they understood the Lufthansa saga. They felt they knew the crew. Yet one of the men Burke trusted most barely registered in their minds. He slipped through collective memory the same way he slipped through investigations for years. And that was not accidental. Frenchy's strength was not that he was fearless. No one in that life was fearless. Fear was constant. The fear of betrayal. The fear of prison. The fear of a knock at the door before dawn. What separated men was how they managed that fear. Some drank it away. Some talked it away. Some let it eat them alive. Frenchy absorbed it and kept working. When the camera cuts away from him in Goodfellas, it feels insignificant. Just a transition. But in reality, his story was not a footnote. It was interwoven with decisions that would determine who lived and who disappeared. He stood close enough to Burke to hear the change in his voice when paranoia set in. Close enough to understand when a conversation was not just a conversation, but a verdict. That is the lane he operated in. Not the lane of flashy robberies and cocaine-fueled nights. The lane of aftermath, of consequence, of making sure the machine did not fall apart under the weight of its own success. He was not a tourist in that world. He was infrastructure, and infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. The tragedy, or perhaps the brilliance, of Frenchy McMahon is that he did not fail in the way others did. He did not implode in public. He did not become the face of a scandal. He did not narrate his own legend. He remained what he had always been: quiet, controlled, useful. As we move deeper into this story, we will leave the movie behind. We will step into the years before and after that fleeting cameo. We will look at how a man can be both invisible and indispensable. How trust is earned in rooms where a wrong word can be fatal. And how one of Jimmy Burke's most dangerous enforcers managed to stand in plain sight while the world looked elsewhere. Because the man you barely saw was not an extra. He was a decision waiting to be made. And the night the bodies started disappearing, that decision would matter more than anyone realized. Chapter 2. Before Jimmy Burke, Frenchy's criminal origins. Long before the Lufthansa money, before the bodies in trunks and the whispered cleanups, there was a different kind of night. A colder one, a younger one, a boy standing on a Queens sidewalk, hands in his pockets, watching older men conduct business without ever raising their voices. He didn't understand the language yet, but he understood the tone. Calm, controlled, efficient. That was the first education. Thomas McMahon did not grow up in a cinematic version of crime. There were no dramatic speeches, no operatic violence playing out in slow motion. There were small apartments, tight streets, men working construction, driving trucks, tending bars. Irish-American neighborhoods where pride ran deep and opportunity ran thin, where you learned quickly that the loudest man in the room was rarely the most powerful one. He was not born into the Mafia. He was not raised on Sicilian codes or family rituals. He was raised around something more American, more hybrid. Crews that were not bound by blood, but by usefulness. Loyalty formed through shared risk rather than ancestry. It was not about old-world ceremony. It was about who showed up when things got complicated. In the 1950s and early 1960s, New York's underworld was evolving. Ethnic lines blurred at the edges. Irish crews, Italian crews, mixed operations tied together by gambling, loan sharking, hijackings. The city was a living machine, and crime was one of its gears. If you wanted in, you didn't ask for permission. You proved yourself necessary. Frenchy learned that early. He was not flashy as a teenager, not the kind of kid who picked fights for attention. He watched, observed patterns. Who paid on time? Who didn't? Which bars were safe to conduct quiet conversations in? Which corners were too exposed? He saw how money moved like a tide, rising and falling depending on who controlled the flow. Most young men in that environment fell into crime the way others fell into trades. You apprenticed. You ran errands. You drove a car and kept your mouth shut. You learned that information was more valuable than bravado. It was not romantic. It was transactional. His first jobs were small, running number slips between bookmakers, collecting modest debts from men who were late but not defiant, standing beside older associates during conversations that required subtle pressure. No yelling, no violence, just presence, a reminder. He understood something many did not. Reputation is built quietly. Every time he showed up on time, every time he delivered money intact, every time he absorbed an insult without reacting, those moments accumulated, like deposits in a bank account that only certain men had access to. There is a difference between a criminal and a professional criminal. A criminal reacts. He chases opportunity. He improvises recklessly. A professional treats illegality like a job description. There are standards. There are expectations. There are consequences for sloppiness. Frenchy gravitated toward the second model. In those years, hijackings were common currency. Trucks moved through industrial corridors carrying goods that could disappear without much noise. electronics, clothing, cigarettes. A crew that could intercept and redistribute those goods quietly became valuable to larger organizations. But hijackings required discipline, timing, coordination. Panic could destroy everything. Frenchy learned to be the steady one in those operations. The man who did not speed unnecessarily. The man who did not talk about the job afterward in a crowded bar. The man who did not suddenly start wearing expensive suits 2 days later. In that world, restraint was armor. His nickname did not come from France. It came from his demeanor. Some said it was because he carried himself with a kind of detached calm, almost European in its reserve. Others said it was simply neighborhood shorthand that stuck. Nicknames in that life were like brands burned into skin. You did not choose them. They chose you. By his early 20s, he had built something more valuable than cash. He had built trust. Older operators began to include him in meetings that were not just about running errands. He listened more than he spoke. That made him useful. Men revealed more when they did not feel interrupted. Fear existed, of course. Every man in that life felt it. The fear of police raids. The fear of betrayal. The fear of being on the wrong side of a power shift. But Frenchy did not broadcast his fear. He processed it internally, like a man storing winter supplies in a cellar, preparing quietly rather than complaining about the cold. There were moments that tested him. A debtor who refused to pay. A job that went sideways when a truck driver resisted. A police car appearing at the wrong intersection. In those seconds, you saw what a man was made of. Some froze. Some overreacted. Frenchy adjusted. Calculated the next move instead of flailing. Word spread. Not loudly. Not publicly. But in back rooms and over coffee. He's solid. He doesn't scare easy. He doesn't talk. That was the currency that mattered. He also understood hierarchy. He did not pretend to be more than he was. Ambition in that world had to be expressed carefully. Too eager, and you looked like a threat. Too passive, and you became irrelevant. Frenchy walked the narrow middle path. Present. Capable. Never demanding. It was during this period that he began crossing paths with men who were orbiting a rising figure named Jimmy Burke. Burke was building something structured, efficient. He did not tolerate recklessness. He needed men who could execute without improvising themselves into trouble. Frenchy's reputation preceded him. Before the formal connection to Burke, there were indirect collaborations. Shared trucks. Shared gambling interests. Shared problem solving. Each interaction was a test. Would he hold up under pressure? Would he protect shared interests? Would he keep his name out of unnecessary conversations? He did. The underworld is like a lattice of wires. Touch one, and vibrations travel. Frenchy's name began traveling those wires. Quietly. Consistently. Reliable Irish kid. Doesn't drink too much. Doesn't get emotional. Gets the job done. There were other temptations in that life. Drugs were creeping into the city. Fast money. Faster collapse. Some end up in. Some drowned. Frenchy kept his distance. Not out of morality, but calculation. Drugs brought heat. Heat brought investigations. He preferred steadier income streams. Gambling. Hijacking. Loans. Loan sharking taught him another lesson. Patience. You did not break a man immediately. You let interest compound. Like a snowball rolling downhill, the debt grew until repayment became inevitable. The key was timing. Push too hard, and you lost the stream of payments. Too soft, and you lost authority. Frenchy became adept at reading desperation. The slight tremor in a man's voice. The way eyes avoided contact. He learned to apply pressure with minimal spectacle. A visit. A conversation. A reminder of shared understanding. Violence was always implied, rarely displayed. By the time the 1960s deepened, he was no longer a runner. He was a participant. He had his own responsibilities, his own small network. Men who answered to him, not because he shouted, but because he delivered. There is an illusion that power always looks like dominance. In reality, sustainable power looks like calm. It looks like someone who can walk into a tense room and lower the temperature rather than raise it. Frenchy cultivated that presence. He also cultivated distance. He did not bring unnecessary friends into the life. He did not mix business with reckless personal drama. Compartmentalization became second nature. Like separate drawers in a filing cabinet, each aspect of his life stayed in its place. When law enforcement conducted occasional sweeps, his name rarely surfaced prominently. He was there, but not central in reports. That invisibility was not luck. It was strategy. He did not position himself as the public face of anything. All of this laid groundwork. By the time he formally aligned under Jimmy Burke's operational umbrella, he was not a gamble. He was an asset, a man who had already proven that he could handle the gray zones of criminal enterprise without losing composure. Burke valued predictability. Predictability in crime is rare. Frenchy offered it. In later years, when chaos erupted after the Lufthansa Heist, people would wonder how certain men managed to survive the purge while others vanished. The answer was not mystical. It was rooted in years of demonstrated discipline. Frenchy had spent his youth constructing something invisible but solid. Like reinforced concrete hidden beneath asphalt, you did not see it, but it supported everything above it. He did not crave spotlight. He did not crave legend. He craved stability within instability. A strange ambition, perhaps, but in the underworld, it was the difference between a headline and a ghost. And as the 1970s approached, as stakes grew larger and operations became more ambitious, that quiet foundation would be tested in ways no one fully anticipated. Because soon, a robbery would change everything. And the boy who learned to stand still on a Queens sidewalk would find himself standing in rooms where silence meant survival and hesitation meant death. Chapter 3. Meeting Jimmy Burke. The first time he was tested, no one said it out loud. There was no formal introduction. No handshake beneath a chandelier. No ceremonial nod to welcome him into something larger than himself. It happened the way most real alliances happen in that world. Through observation. Through repetition. Through a quiet question that hovered in the air. Can this man be trusted when everything is on the line? Jimmy Burke did not collect people. He selected them. By the late 1960s, Burke's operation was tightening into something efficient and disciplined. Hijackings were no longer random acts of desperation. They were structured, planned like military maneuvers. Each participant had a role. Each role had consequences. Burke understood something fundamental about organized crime that many others ignored. Chaos attracts attention. Attention invites destruction. He wanted control, and control required men who were not liabilities. Thomas Frenchy McMahon entered Burke's orbit gradually. At first, it was peripheral work, shared connections and gambling, small coordination between hijacking crews, mutual acquaintances vouching for him in conversations that were careful, measured, coded. He's steady. That was the phrase that traveled. In that life, steady was higher praise than brave. Brave men did reckless things. Steady men finished the job and went home without needing applause. Burke noticed that. Burke was not theatrical. He did not need to shout to command a room. He had a coiled intensity, a mind that processed risk like a calculator scanning numbers. He could be charming 1 minute and ice cold the next. Men who worked around him learned quickly that moods were not random. They were responses to competence or incompetence. Frenchy never gave him incompetence. Their first significant interaction came after a hijacking went sideways in Queens. A truck was intercepted cleanly, the goods transferred without incident. But one of the younger associates panicked at the sight of a patrol car 2 blocks away and abandoned a vehicle in the wrong place. Sloppy, traceable, dangerous. The room was tense that night. Burke sat at the head of the table in a back office that smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat. He listened while others spoke too much. Excuses floated like smoke. Fingers pointed subtly, never directly. Frenchy didn't talk. When asked what happened, he explained it in simple, clean sentences. No embellishment, no defensive tone, just facts. He acknowledged the mistake, but he did not dramatize it. He suggested a correction, quiet relocation of the abandoned vehicle, a shift in drop points for future operations. Burke studied him. There is a moment in any leader's mind when assessment turns into selection. Burke saw something in Frenchy that he did not see in the others. Absence of ego. Ego complicated things. Ego made men argue. Ego made them try to prove themselves at the wrong times. Frenchy was not trying to prove anything. From that night forward, he was included more directly. He began attending meetings that were not just about execution, but about planning. Meetings where routes were mapped out on paper, where drivers were chosen not for enthusiasm, but for reliability, where contingency plans were discussed before the first move was ever made. Burke did not announce promotions. He expanded responsibility. Frenchy felt a shift. It meant more trust. It also meant more danger. Because the closer you stand to the center of power in organized crime, the more heat you absorb. Law enforcement does not chase the peripheral figures first. They move inward, toward decision-makers, toward organizers. Burke knew this. That was why he was careful. He built layers between himself and the street. Not to distance himself entirely, but to buffer risk. Frenchy became one of those layers. Not a shield, not a scapegoat, a conduit. A man who could transmit orders downward without distortion and transmit information upward without embellishment. It was a delicate role. Too much initiative, and you look ambitious. Too little, and you become irrelevant. Frenchy mastered the balance. The crew itself was evolving. Henry Hill was already embedded, charismatic and energetic, thriving in social spaces. Tommy DeSimone moved like a lit fuse, unpredictable and volatile. Angelo Sepe carried his own quiet weight. Louis Cafora played his part in the machinery. Each man had a lane. Frenchy's lane was narrower, but deeper. Burke trusted him with things that required composure. Conversations with uneasy partners. Evaluations of whom might be unreliable. Assessments of small details that others overlooked. He began to rely on Frenchy's read of situations. Will he hold up? That question surfaced often in that world. Frenchy's answer, when asked about someone else, was measured. He did not exaggerate praise. He did not rush to condemn. Burke respected that. A man who rushes to label another man as weak is often hiding his own insecurity. Frenchy rarely labeled. As their relationship developed, it became clear that Burke valued predictability over personality. Henry could charm a room. Tommy could intimidate it. Frenchy stabilized it. There's a kind of power in stabilization that goes unnoticed by outsiders. Think of it like ballast in a ship. Without it, the vessel tips under stress. With it, the vessel remains upright, even when waves crash over the deck. Frenchy was ballast. He was also observant. He watched how Burke reacted to pressure, how he shifted tone when a plan faltered, how paranoia crept in slowly, like fog rolling across water. Burke's mind never stopped calculating. He did not forget slights. He did not forgive recklessness easily. Frenchy understood that closeness to such a mind required caution. He did not try to mirror Burke's authority. He complemented it. When Burke was heated, Frenchy remained cool. When Burke was silent, Frenchy did not fill the silence unnecessarily. That restraint deepened trust. By the early 1970s, Frenchy was not just another associate orbiting the crew. He was inside the operational nucleus, not as a public face, not as a charismatic lieutenant, but as a reliable executor of decisions. It is important to understand what that meant in practice. It meant he knew about plans before they happened. It meant he was present when sensitive matters were discussed. It meant he could be tasked with assignments that required both discretion and finality. Burke did not distribute those tasks lightly. Trust in that world was like a chain. Each link mattered. One weak link, and the chain snapped. Burke saw Frenchy as forged steel, unlikely to crack under stress. There were moments of doubt, of course. Every alliance in organized crime carries an undercurrent of suspicion. Men test each other without admitting it. They create small scenarios to see how someone reacts. Frenchy passed those tests. He did not talk outside designated circles. He did not embellish stories in bars. He did not flaunt proximity to Burke's status. That humility reinforced his position. By contrast, others in the orbit sometimes revealed their insecurities, bragging about inside knowledge, drinking too much, sharing stories that should have stayed inside rooms. Burke noticed those things, and so did Frenchy. As the crew's ambitions grew, so did the stakes. Hijackings became more calculated, targets more lucrative, planning more intricate. They were no longer improvising crime. They were engineering it. Burke wanted engineers. Frenchy became one. Their relationship was not sentimental. There were no declarations of brotherhood. It was professional, built on evidence, reinforced through action. When tensions flared within the crew, Frenchy did not take sides emotionally. He aligned with structure, with order, with Burke's decision. That consistency mattered. It also placed him in a precarious position. The closer you stand to a man like Jimmy Burke, the more responsibility you inherit when things unravel. And things were destined to unravel. Because ambition expands, Burke was not content with modest scores. He studied opportunities the way a chess player studies openings. He looked for moves that would change the board entirely. The Lufthansa cargo terminal became one of those moves. But before Lufthansa, before the money and the murders, there was something else happening. Consolidation. Burke was tightening his circle. He was evaluating who would be essential in larger operations, who could handle pressure when millions were at stake, who would not crumble if questioned by law enforcement. Frenchy's presence in that inner circle was no accident. He had spent years proving himself in smaller arenas. Now he was being positioned for something larger. It was during one late-night meeting, long before Lufthansa entered headlines, that the dynamic crystallized. The room was dim. Cigarette smoke layered the air. Burke laid out a hypothetical scenario. A large job. Complex. High risk. He looked at each man in turn. When his eyes settled on Frenchy, there was no speech. Just a pause. A silent acknowledgement. An understanding that if the job required a steady hand, Frenchy would provide it. That moment did not make newspapers. It did not become legend, but marked a shift. Frenchy was no longer peripheral. He was trusted. And in that world, trust was heavier than cash, heavier than guns, heavier than reputation. Trust meant that when paranoia eventually seeped into the room, when suspicion replaced camaraderie, Frenchy would not be the first name on a list. But trust is also double-edged, because when a leader like Burke feels cornered, the men he trusts most are often the ones he leans on to execute the hardest decisions. Frenchy did not yet know how hard those decisions would become. He only knew that he had earned proximity. And proximity, in the orbit of a man like Jimmy Burke, was both privilege and warning. The path forward would not be glamorous. It would not be cinematic. It would be methodical, strategic, quiet. And soon, that quiet would be shattered by a robbery so large it would shake the city. When that moment arrived, the question would no longer be whether Frenchy was inside the circle. The question would be how far inside he was willing to go. Chapter 4. The crew structure. Who really ran things? The money hadn't even been stolen yet, and already the tension was there. You could feel it in the air of those back rooms, in the way chairs scraped a little too loudly against tile floors, in the way certain men waited half a second longer before speaking, calculating not just what to say, but who might repeat it later. The Lufthansa robbery would one day explode into headlines, but long before that, there was something quieter unfolding, the architecture of power. Because in the Burke crew, not everyone was equal. From the outside, it looked like a pack of wise guys moving together, laughing, drinking, hustling, grabbing what they could from a city that never seemed to notice the hands slipping into its pockets. But from the inside, it was layered, structured, almost corporate in its design. At the center was Jimmy Burke, not a made man, not an official capo in a traditional sense. But make no mistake, he was the gravitational force. He did not need ceremony to command obedience. His authority came from competence, from results, from the fact that when he planned something, it worked. Burke was not loud about his power. He wore it the way some men wear a watch, understated, but always present. When he entered a room, conversations adjusted, not because he demanded silence, but because everyone instinctively measured their words in his presence. He was the strategist, the long-game thinker, the one who saw beyond the immediate score to the ripple effects that followed. Orbiting that center were different types of men. Henry Hill stood in the outer inner circle, close enough to taste the influence, but not quite in the deepest chambers. He was charismatic, social. He thrived in conversation. He was the connector, the facilitator, the one who could move between worlds. Restaurants, airports, nightclubs. Henry belonged in those spaces. He was valuable because he talked well. But talking well and knowing everything are two different things. Tommy DeSimone was another story entirely. Volatile. Electric. A man who carried violence like a reflex rather than a tool. He was fearless in the way young men often are, because they haven't yet seen the full cost of their own impulses. Tommy was useful when intimidation was required, when unpredictability itself became leverage. But volatility has a shelf life. Then there were men like Angelo Sepe and Louis Cafora, dependable, present, woven into the machinery. They played their parts without trying to rewrite the script. Each had their lane. Each understood the boundaries. And then there was Frenchy McMahon. He did not fit neatly into the roles audiences prefer. He was not the storyteller. He was not the hothead. He was not the public face of anything. He was not even the man cracking jokes in the corner. He was something more subtle. He was operational muscle, but not in the simplistic sense of brute force. Muscle, in organized crime, can mean different things. It can mean someone who throws punches. But more often, it means someone who enforces structure. Someone who ensures that decisions made at the top ripple downward without distortion. Frenchy existed in that layer. The crew functioned like a machine. Burke at the top, generating direction. Beneath him, men translating that direction into action. Beneath them, runners, drivers, small-time associates who rarely saw the full picture. Henry moved horizontally across that structure. He connected dots. He facilitated movement. He brought in information from outside sources. But when sensitive decisions were made, especially the kind that required absolute discretion, the circle narrowed. And that circle did not always include Henry. This is where many viewers misunderstand the hierarchy. Because the film shows Henry at the center of everything. The camera follows him. The narration belongs to him. It feels like he is inside every secret. He wasn't. Frenchy's lane was different. He was not there to charm Lufthansa employees or smooth over social situations. He was there when logistics were discussed, when contingency plans were evaluated, when a conversation shifted from how to do a job to how to contain the fallout afterward. Think of the crew like a theater production. Henry was on stage, interacting with the audience. Tommy was the unpredictable performer who could electrify or derail the scene. But behind the curtain, there were stagehands, lighting technicians, people who made sure the structure didn't collapse mid-performance. Frenchy was one of those stagehands. Except in this theater, if something collapsed, people disappeared. The structure depended on compartmentalization. Not everyone needed to know everything. Burke was deliberate about that. Information was distributed like ration water. Enough to keep operations moving, but not enough to flood the system. The fewer people who knew the full scope of a plan, the fewer potential leaks. Frenchy understood this instinctively. He did not demand access to conversations. He earned it. There's a particular kind of trust that develops between two men who do not need to over-explain themselves. Burke could look at Frenchy across a room and know he was aligned. No theatrics. No grand statements of loyalty. Just alignment. It was in the small gestures. A nod when a sensitive topic was raised. A shift in posture when someone unreliable entered the room. The absence of visible anxiety during tense negotiations. These signals matter more than words in that world. Henry's strength was that he could talk his way through complications. Frenchy's strength was that he could stand silently beside a complication and make it smaller. He was not the face of intimidation, but his presence reinforced it. When someone was late on payments, Henry might call them. Tommy might threaten them. But Frenchy's visit carried weight because it was rare. When he showed up, it meant the situation had escalated beyond casual correction. He did not shout. He did not need to. The crew's internal structure became clearer as the stakes grew. Jobs got bigger. Risks intensified. With each successful operation, confidence expanded. But so did paranoia. Because the more you succeed in organized crime, the more you fear exposure. Burke's genius was in anticipating exposure before it arrived. He thought about aftermath before most men thought about execution. And in those aftermath conversations, Frenchy was present. This is why, when people later try to reconstruct what happened inside the crew, the accounts fell fragmented. Henry told what he saw, what he experienced, what he felt, but there were rooms he was not in. Decisions made in spaces where charm was irrelevant. Frenchy lived in those rooms. He was not made in the Italian Mafia sense. He did not have formal standing in the Lucchese hierarchy. But in Burke's operational world, formal titles mattered less than functional reliability. If Burke was the CEO, Frenchy was a chief operations officer without a business card. He translated strategy into structure. He ensured that when a truck was intercepted, the redistribution plan was already mapped. That when cash moved, it moved through channels that minimized noise. That when tensions flared internally, they were evaluated rather than reacted to. There is something almost bureaucratic about this layer of crime. It is not cinematic. It is administrative. Lists, schedules, evaluations of risk. Frenchy thrived there. He did not need adrenaline to feel alive. He needed order within disorder. As Lufthansa began to take shape as an idea, still just an idea at this stage, the crew's hierarchy tightened further. The job would be massive, larger than anything they had attempted. It would require precision beyond ordinary hijackings. Burke started looking at his circle differently. Who could handle this? Who would keep their mouths shut if questioned? Who would resist the temptation to flash cash in the weeks afterward? Henry was involved in the build-up. His connections mattered. His access mattered. But when it came to evaluating which men would be trusted inside the innermost ring, Burke looked at track records. Frenchy's record was clean in one specific way. He did not create problems. In that world, not creating problems was a superpower. Tommy created problems. Sometimes useful ones, but still problems. Henry occasionally created problems through excess. Others created problems through insecurity. Frenchy did not. That absence of friction elevated him. He was not the most charismatic, not the most feared, but perhaps the most predictable. And predictability is gold when millions of dollars are at stake. The crew's structure was not democratic. It was not egalitarian. It was built on earned proximity. Frenchy had earned his. And as plans evolved from whispers to blueprints, from hypothetical to imminent, his role shifted subtly again. He was no longer just part of the machinery. He was part of the safeguard. Because Burke knew something others did not fully grasp yet. The robbery would be the easy part. The real danger would come after. When greed surfaced. When paranoia bloomed. When loose ends threatened to unravel everything. In those moments, the hierarchy would be tested. And the men in the deepest lane, the quiet lane, would be called upon. Henry might narrate the thrill. Tommy might embody the violence. But Frenchy would stand in the background of decisions that would determine who remained in that crew and who vanished from it. The structure was in place. The roles were defined. And soon, the machine would be pushed harder than it had ever been pushed before. When that pressure came, it would reveal something about every man involved, especially the one most people barely noticed. Chapter 5. Planning the Lufthansa Heist. The idea did not arrive with fireworks. It slipped into the room quietly, like a rumor that refused to leave. Millions in unguarded cash. Foreign currency stacked in canvas bags. A system that relied more on routine than vigilance. It sounded too clean to be real. And that was precisely why it lingered in the minds of men who had built their lives on spotting weaknesses. Before a single move was made, there were nights of calculation. The crew did not jump at it blindly. This was not a corner store stick-up. This was not a passing opportunity on a highway. This was something bigger, something that could tilt the board entirely. It required patience, layers, and absolute discipline. The first conversations were cautious. In a back room that smelled of cigarette smoke and old wood, the details were laid out piece by piece. Cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport. Lufthansa. Cash shipments. Currency exchanges moving through a system that trusted schedules more than security. There was an employee on the inside. A weakness in the chain. Information is the spark in every major crime. Without it, ambition is just fantasy. Henry Hill played his part in bringing the spark closer to the flame. He moved easily in the social world. He cultivated relationships. He knew how to extract details without making it feel like extraction. But when those details were brought back to Burke, the tone shifted. The room changed temperature. Burke did not get excited. He got analytical. He treated the information like blueprints for a building he had not yet decided to construct. He wanted to know everything. Timetables, guard rotations, how money was counted, how long it sat in holding rooms before being transferred, who had keys, who had codes, who had bad habits. Frenchy was in those rooms now, not at the center of conversation, but close enough to see how Burke's mind worked when confronted with opportunity. He watched as enthusiasm was tempered with skepticism. He listened as Burke dissected risk like a surgeon examining an X-ray. There is a myth that great robberies are fueled by bravado. In reality, they are fueled by boredom with small scores and confidence in process. Burke had both. The planning stretched for months. Information was verified, re-verified, tested for holes. Like probing a wall for weak spots before knocking it down, Burke pushed on every assumption. What if the inside man falters? What if a guard improvises? What if law enforcement response time is shorter than estimated? Frenchy absorbed the discussions. His role was not to charm insiders or manage outside relationships. His role was to help translate strategy into operational discipline. When Burke asked, "How long can we hold them?" Frenchy thought about timing, about how fear works, about how men behave when confronted with controlled force. He did not answer emotionally. He answered practically. The crew was selected carefully. Not everyone who wanted him was invited. Large operations create temptation. Men see dollar signs and lose proportion. Burke knew that too many participants meant too many mouths, too many variables, too many potential leaks. He trimmed the roster, kept it lean. Frenchy's inclusion in that lean roster was telling. He was not the inside contact. He was not the charismatic connector. He was there because Burke trusted him to be steady if something deviated from plan. Meetings became more structured. Routes were discussed. Vehicles assigned. Roles defined. Who would enter the cargo building? Who would control employees? Who would guard the perimeter? Who would manage post-robbery movement of cash? The airport itself was studied. Frenchy visited the area, not as a criminal casing a target, but as an observer blending into background traffic. He noted shift changes, delivery patterns, blind spots in security. He did not carry a camera. He carried memory. Memory is safer than evidence. He understood that one careless detail could unravel months of preparation. A license plate remembered. A face described too vividly. The margin for error narrowed as the potential payout expanded. In the quiet of those planning sessions, something else began to take shape. Anticipation. Not the loud anticipation of reckless youth. A colder anticipation. The awareness that this job, if executed cleanly, would elevate the crew beyond ordinary hijackers. It would be history. But history carries weight. Burke spoke often about restraint. No spending, he would say, even before the money was in anyone's hands. No sudden changes. You keep living the same way. He repeated it like a mantra. Frenchy listened. He knew human nature. He had watched men lose discipline for far less money. He understood that the robbery was only the first test. The second test would be silence and patience afterward. And that second test might be harder. As the date approached, tension thickened. Not panic. Not yet. But awareness. You could see it in small gestures. Men checking watches. Conversations shortening when strangers entered rooms. The inside contact growing more anxious as his proximity to risk became tangible. Frenchy noticed that anxiety. He understood that fear spreads if not contained. In one late meeting, the inside man began to ramble about potential complications. Security changes. Unpredictable supervisors. The room stiffened. Too much speculation could paralyze execution. Burke did not raise his voice. He asked direct questions. Precise ones. Forced clarity. Frenchy sat quietly, measuring the inside man's breathing, the tremor in his voice. He did not see collapse. He saw nerves. Manageable. Afterward, when the inside man left, Burke turned to the core group. "He'll hold," he said. It was less a statement than a judgment. Frenchy nodded, because he believed it too. Roles were finalized. On the night itself, timing would be everything. Minutes would matter. Seconds might. The crew rehearsed mentally. They did not stage practice runs in obvious ways. That would be foolish. But they walked through scenarios verbally. What if a guard resists? What if an employee tries to trigger an alarm? What if a vehicle stalls? Each answer was deliberate. Frenchy's responsibility leaned toward control, ensuring compliance without chaos, ensuring that fear in the room did not become hysteria. He understood that violence, if used, had to be surgical, not emotional. The more disciplined the crew appeared, the more likely employees would comply without escalation. There was something almost militaristic about the final days of planning. Equipment checked, vehicles secured, timing synchronized. Burke did not delegate lightly. When he assigned a task, it was because he had already calculated that the man could handle it. Frenchy's assignment placed him close to the heart of execution. Not the spotlight role, but the stabilizing one. He would not be the face remembered by hostages. He would not be the one cracking jokes under tension. He would be the one ensuring that no one in the crew deviated under pressure. The night arrived cold and unremarkable. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no visible omen, just darkness over the airport and a crew moving with rehearsed precision. The entry was clean. Employees were controlled quickly. Commands were firm, but not theatrical. The cash was located, secured, moved. Frenchy's focus remained narrow. Watch the room. Watch the crew. Watch for the unexpected. Time felt elastic inside that cargo terminal. Every minute stretched longer than it was. But the plan held. Vehicles departed on schedule. Routes were followed. There were no gunshots. No alarms blaring. Just a quiet extraction of more than $5 million in cash and currency. The largest cash robbery in American history at that time. When the crew regrouped in the hours afterward, there was no cheering. Not yet. Burke's face did not glow with triumph. It remained measured, because he understood something the others were still processing. The robbery was done. The real danger had just begun. Frenchy sensed it too. He watched how some men's eyes changed when they saw the stacks of money. How greed flickered like a small flame seeking oxygen. Burke reiterated the rule. No spending. The rule was simple. The money would be distributed. Carefully. Quietly. And everyone would behave as if nothing had changed. Frenchy believed in the rule. He believed in the discipline that had carried them through execution. But he also knew something else. Large sums of cash have gravity. They pull up men's impulses. They distort judgment. And if anyone in that circle lost discipline, the consequences would not be theoretical. As the first days after the heist passed, newspapers exploded with coverage. Helicopters, FBI briefings, headlines screaming about the audacity of it all. The city buzzed. Inside the crew, silence deepened. Phones were used sparingly. Meetings were smaller. Eyes were sharper. Frenchy noticed deviations. A man mentioning a new car. Another talking too casually in a bar. Subtle shifts in posture. Burke noticed them too. And paranoia, once planted, grows quickly. The planning phase had required discipline. The aftermath would require something colder. And Frenchy, who had built his entire reputation on steadiness, would soon find himself standing at the edge of decisions far darker than the robbery itself. Because when millions of dollars move through a crew of ambitious men, loyalty becomes fragile. And in the weeks to come, the hierarchy that had planned the perfect heist will be tested by something far more dangerous than airport security. Suspicion. Chapter 6, December 11th, 1978, The Heist Night. It begins in the dark. Not the cinematic kind with swelling music and whispered countdowns. Just the cold, indifferent dark of a winter morning at John F. Kennedy Airport. The kind of dark that makes every shadow look longer than it is. The kind that hides movement until it's too late. Inside the Lufthansa cargo building, fluorescent lights hummed. Paperwork shuffled. Men yawned. Routine wrapped around the place like insulation. They had done this 1,000 times before. Cash transfers, foreign currency, bags moving from one secured area to another. Systems built on repetition. Trust built on habit. Outside, engines idled. The crew did not rush. They did not chatter nervously. They did not crack jokes to mask fear. They moved with the quiet certainty of men who had rehearsed this night in their heads for months. The inside man had done his part. He had provided access, timing, weaknesses. That spark had turned into a full blueprint. Now it was about execution. Jimmy Burke was not at the cargo terminal. He didn't need to be. That was part of his discipline. Leaders who physically stand at crime scenes take unnecessary risks. He trusted the plan. He trusted the men he selected. Among them was Frenchy McMahon. He was not the loud one issuing threats. He was not the one whose face would later become the centerpiece of dramatic retellings. He was one of the steady presences, there to ensure that control never slipped. The entry was precise. Doors open under pressure, not chaos. Employees were gathered quickly. Firm commands. No screaming. No improvisation. The men inside understood that panic spreads faster than fire. If they remained calm, the room would remain manageable. Frenchy watched hands. He watched eyes. He watched breathing. Fear reveals itself in small movements. A twitch, a glance toward an exit, a slight shift toward resistance. He had learned to read those signs years earlier collecting debts in Queens. That skill mattered now more than ever. Employees were restrained, not brutalized. The goal was compliance, not spectacle. Violence was a last resort because violence complicates narratives later. Injuries bring investigations. Panic brings mistakes. The cash was located. Bags were heavier than they looked in planning sessions. Stacked currency carries a physical presence. It feels different in your hands than theoretical numbers scribbled on paper. Foreign currency. American bills. Millions. Time compressed. Inside that building, minutes felt like seconds. Outside, seconds felt like minutes. Every passing car was a question mark. Every distant siren, a potential disaster. Frenchy kept his movements economical. No wasted gestures. No unnecessary words. If someone hesitated, he stepped closer. Not threatening. Just present. Presence alone can steer behavior when backed by credibility. The crew worked as rehearsed. Load. Move. Exit. The trucks rolled away into the winter morning before the full weight of what had happened registered inside the cargo terminal. No shots fired. No alarms triggered in time. No chaotic chase scenes. Just a surgical removal of more than $5 million in cash and currency. The largest cash robbery in American history at that point. When news broke later that morning, it sounded almost impossible. Anchors spoke with disbelief. Law enforcement officials struggled to explain how such a theft could happen in a place designed for security. But inside the crew, celebration was muted. There were no champagne bottles popped in the immediate aftermath, because Burke had drilled something into them repeatedly. The job is not finished when you leave the scene. The job is finished when you survive the fallout. Frenchy understood that instinctively. After regrouping at a safe location, the cash was inventoried again. Counted carefully. The sheer volume of it altered the mood in the room. Eyes lingered longer on stacks. Silence carried more weight. Burke was not present for that count, but his instructions were. No spending. No sudden lifestyle changes. No new cars. No flashy jewelry. You live exactly as you lived yesterday. The rule was simple, and yet, human nature makes simple rules difficult. Frenchy watched the others. He did not smile broadly. He did not speak about what the money meant. He had seen smaller scores disrupt men before. He knew what temptation looked like. Temptation was already in the air. The days that followed were filled with tension, disguised as normalcy. News coverage intensified. FBI press conferences. Airport officials scrambling to explain vulnerabilities. Sketches of suspects that bore no resemblance to the actual men involved. Inside the crew, meetings became more controlled. Phones were used sparingly. Conversations shortened when unfamiliar faces approached. Burke's paranoia, which had always simmered beneath the surface, began to thicken. He had executed the perfect robbery. But perfection breeds attention, and attention breeds danger. Frenchy sensed the shift. He noticed how Burke's tone hardened when discussing distribution of cash. He noticed how certain names were mentioned with subtle suspicion. He noticed how Burke's eyes lingered longer on individuals who had seemed trustworthy weeks earlier. Large sums of money distort trust. Men who had been reliable at $10,000 can become unpredictable at $1 million. Frenchy remained steady. He did not rush to claim his share. He did not ask when distribution would be finalized. He did not joke about what he might buy. He waited. That patience deepened Burke's confidence in him. Meanwhile, small cracks began to appear elsewhere. One associate reportedly bought an expensive car too soon. Another mentioned money in the wrong setting. The rule, no spending, began to fray at the edges. Burke's reaction was immediate and cold. He did not scream. He recalculated. Paranoia in organized crime is not irrational. It is strategic fear. It is the understanding that betrayal often starts with carelessness. Carelessness becomes leverage for law enforcement. Frenchy found himself pulled closer into Burke's inner orbit during those conversations. "Who's solid?" Burke would ask. Not loudly, not theatrically. Frenchy answered carefully. He did not rush to accuse. He did not shield recklessness out of misplaced loyalty. His loyalty was to structure, to survival. As the investigation intensified publicly, the crew tightened privately. Surveillance rumors circulated. Whispers about informants drifted through neighborhoods like smoke. Frenchy maintained his routine. No new clothes. No new car. No visible shift in behavior. That invisibility was protection. He knew that the true test of discipline begins after success. Anyone can be brave during action. It is much harder to remain disciplined during reward. Burke's trust in Frenchy was not built solely on execution night. It was built on what followed. While others allowed the magnitude of the score to inflate their sense of invincibility, Frenchy treated it like any other job. Completed, stored, contained. But beneath that surface calm, something darker was forming. Because Burke began to question not just spending, but loyalty. He replayed conversations in his head, reassessed body language, wondered who might crack under federal pressure. The heist had gone perfectly, but perfection makes leaders uneasy. It feels unnatural. It feels like the calm before a storm. Frenchy sensed that too. He understood that in a crew structured around control, any hint of unpredictability becomes a threat. And threats, in that world, are not debated endlessly. They are eliminated. The shift from triumph to suspicion happened gradually. One disappearance, then another. Explanations offered casually. Vacation. Moved away. Personal issues. But inside the core circle, everyone understood the pattern. Loose ends were being tied. Or cut. Frenchy did not protest. He did not question openly. He understood the logic, even if he did not enjoy its implications. Because in organized crime, survival often demands choices that would horrify outsiders. The night of the heist had been controlled chaos. The weeks afterward were controlled fear. And Frenchy stood at the intersection of both. He had proven himself on execution night. Now he would be tested in the aftermath. Because when paranoia tightens its grip, even trusted men feel the pressure. Burke trusted Frenchy. But trust, in that world, is never unconditional. As bodies began to surface and rumors thickened, one unspoken question lingered beneath every meeting. If loyalty wavers, who enforces the consequence? And in the quiet rooms where those decisions were made, Frenchy's presence was no longer peripheral. It was essential. The robbery had made history. The fallout would make ghosts. And Frenchy McMahon was standing close enough to both to understand that the real story of December 11 did not end at the airport. It had only just begun. Chapter 7, The Paranoia Begins. The money was still warm when the fear set in. Not fear of police. Not yet. The FBI was loud, visible, predictable in its outrage. Press conferences, task forces, promises of justice. That was noise. Noise could be measured. Noise could be studied. The real fear was quieter. It lived inside the crew. In the days after December 11th, 1978, the Lufthansa score felt almost unreal. More than $5 million in cash and foreign currency had vanished into the winter air, and for a brief, suspended moment, The men responsible believed they had pulled off something mythic. But myth has a shadow. Because money like that changes rooms. It changes the way men look at each other. It magnifies insecurity. It exposes ego. It tempts weakness. And in Jimmy Burke's world, weakness was not a personal flaw. It was a structural threat. Burke understood that before anyone else did. He had drilled the rule into them repeatedly. No spending. No flashy purchases. No new cars. No sudden trips. No expensive clothes. You live the same way you lived yesterday. He had said it calmly. Repeated it with the patience of a teacher warning a classroom before a test. But discipline cracks under weight. The first signs were subtle. A whisper about a man who bought a Cadillac too soon. A rumor about someone flashing cash in a bar. A story told a little too loudly to the wrong audience. Most people would have dismissed those as small mistakes. Burke did not. He saw them as fractures. And fractures, if ignored, widen. Frenchy saw the shift in Burke's demeanor almost immediately. The tone in meetings changed. The pauses grew longer. The eye contact sharper. Conversations became audits. Who's talking? The question was not rhetorical. It was survival. In organized crime, paranoia is not irrational. It is a survival instinct sharpened by history. Every major crew that fell did so because someone talked. Someone bragged. Someone got sloppy. The Lufthansa job was too big to allow sloppiness. Frenchy understood this instinctively. He had not spent his share recklessly. He had not altered his lifestyle. He had not boasted. His steadiness now became even more valuable. Because Burke needed eyes that were not clouded by ego. In the weeks after the robbery, bodies began to appear. Not immediately. Not in dramatic clusters. Just enough to shift the atmosphere. Parnell Stacks, Edwards was one of the first names whispered. He had been tasked with disposing of the getaway van. A simple job. Essential. Invisible. He did not complete it. The van was found. Abandoned. That mistake alone could have unraveled everything. Stacks had also ignored the no-spending rule. Bought an expensive car. Flaunted money in a way that suggested he had not internalized the magnitude of what they had done. From Burke's perspective, that combination was lethal. Frenchy was not in the room when the final decision about Stacks was made. Or perhaps he was. Accounts differ. What matters is this. Once Burke identified someone as a liability, the outcome rarely changed. Stacks was killed. The official narrative, the one most viewers remember, centers on Tommy DeSimone pulling the trigger. And Tommy's volatility makes that believable. But violence in that crew was rarely spontaneous. It was authorized. It was structured. Frenchy understood that difference. The death of Stacks was not just punishment. It was a message, a reinforcement of discipline. But it was also the beginning of something darker. Because once elimination becomes an option, it becomes easier to justify again. Morrie Krugman began pressing for his share. Morrie was not muscle. He was not even core crew. But he knew too much. He had been involved in facilitating parts of the job. He had expectations. And expectations create tension when distribution is delayed. Morrie's repeated phone calls irritated Burke. Not because the money wasn't there, but because pressure from inside the circle was dangerous. A man who feels cheated is unpredictable. Frenchy watched this unfold carefully. He saw how Burke's patience thinned, how discussions about Morrie shifted from frustration to calculation. Can we trust him to stay quiet? That was the real question. The paranoia was not theatrical. It was methodical. Each name connected to Lufthansa was reviewed internally like entries in a ledger. Who had loose lips? Who had financial stress? Who had external problems that might make them vulnerable to law enforcement pressure? Frenchy was often present during these reviews. He did not speak excessively. He did not volunteer dramatic assessments. But when asked directly, he answered with measured honesty. In that world, honesty inside the circle was currency. The crew began to shrink. Angelo Sepe disappeared. Then Louis Cafora. One by one, men connected to the robbery were removed from aboard. Publicly, explanations varied. Personal issues, relocations, bad luck. Privately, the pattern was clear. Burke was eliminating variables. Frenchy was close enough to see how the process evolved. It was not rage-driven. It was preemptive. Burke's mind operated like a chess player, anticipating future moves. If law enforcement applied pressure to one weak piece, it could expose the entire structure. Better to remove weak pieces before that pressure arrived. There is something chilling about that logic. It reframes murder as maintenance. Frenchy did not appear shaken outwardly, but internally, the atmosphere shifted. Because every elimination tightened the circle further. And when circles tighten, even the trusted feel the walls. Trust in organized crime is conditional. Frenchy knew he was trusted, but he also knew that paranoia spares no one permanently. He maintained his discipline meticulously. No sudden purchases, no unnecessary socializing, no careless words. He understood that in this climate, visibility was vulnerability. Burke's paranoia extended beyond spending habits. He began analyzing conversations retroactively. Who knew what? Who might be talking already? The FBI investigation intensified. Agents interviewed airport employees, traced connections, monitored known associates. The press coverage did not fade. That external pressure fed internal suspicion. Frenchy observed how even minor deviations triggered scrutiny. A missed meeting, a rumor about an argument, a stray comment overheard in a diner. Every detail mattered now. The crew that had once celebrated together now moved cautiously around one another. Smiles felt thinner, jokes less frequent, silences longer. In one private conversation, Burke asked Frenchy directly, "You think anyone's going to crack?" It was not a casual question. It was an assessment of stability. Frenchy's answer was careful. He did not offer guarantees. Guarantees are foolish in that life. He assessed each man's temperament. Who could handle interrogation? Who might crumble under isolation? He understood psychological pressure. He had seen men unravel over debts far smaller than this. The paradox of paranoia is that it both protects and destroys. It protects by identifying threats early. It destroys by eroding camaraderie. The Lufthansa crew began operating more like isolated cells than a cohesive unit. Meetings became smaller, communication more guarded. Frenchy's role shifted subtly again. He was no longer just an operational stabilizer. He became a silent witness to the dismantling of the crew from within. He did not question Burke's logic openly. To do so would signal doubt. And doubt, in that climate, was suspicious. But he felt the tension. Because each elimination reinforced a brutal truth. The robbery had not created unity. It had exposed fault lines. Money amplifies character. Some men became reckless. Some became desperate. Some became quiet. Frenchy remained quiet. That quiet was a shield. As months passed, the list of men connected to Lufthansa who were still breathing grew shorter. Law enforcement struggled to build cases. Witnesses were scarce. Bodies were found, but evidence linking them directly to the robbery was elusive. From an investigative standpoint, the paranoia achieved its objective. From a human standpoint, it hollowed the crew. The camaraderie of pre-Lufthansa days was gone, replaced by calculation. Frenchy stood at the center of that transformation. He had not orchestrated it. He had not celebrated it, but he had adapted to it. Adaptation is survival in organized crime. He understood something critical. The robbery was no longer the defining event. The defining event was the purge. And in a purge, proximity to power can either protect you or implicate you. Burke trusted Frenchy. That trust spared him from suspicion. But it also placed him in rooms where irreversible decisions were made. Rooms where names were spoken and fates decided. Rooms where loyalty was tested not through words, but through compliance. As the paranoia deepened, one unspoken reality became clear. The Lufthansa heist had created wealth. The aftermath was creating fear. And fear, once embedded in a crew, changes it permanently. Frenchy could feel that permanence settling in. The job had been flawless. The fallout was not. And as the circle narrowed further, as more names disappeared from the conversation entirely, the question no longer lingered in the background. It stood in the center of every room. When the dust finally settled, who would still be standing? And for Frenchy McMahon, the quiet man who had navigated every shift so far, survival would depend not on what he said, but on how perfectly he continued to say nothing. Chapter 8. The Murder of Parnell Stacks Edwards. The van was still there. That was the mistake. Parked where it should not have been. Visible. Traceable. A silent witness sitting in plain sight. Its metal shell holding the fingerprints of a robbery that was supposed to be flawless. When law enforcement found it, it wasn't just a vehicle. It was a thread. And in a job this big, even a single loose thread could unravel everything. Inside Jimmy Burke's world, that discovery felt like a crack in the foundation. Parnell Stacks Edwards had been given a simple task. Dispose of the getaway van. Make it disappear. Burn it. Strip it. Dump it somewhere it would never be found. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It was cleanup. But cleanup is where jobs either stay perfect or start collapsing. Stacks didn't complete it. Some say he fell asleep. Others say he underestimated the urgency. There are accounts of him getting distracted, drifting back into normal routines too quickly, believing that the danger had already passed. But in Burke's mind, that wasn't a small oversight. It was a liability. And liability, after Lufthansa, had become a death sentence. When word reached Burke that the van had been located, he didn't explode. He didn't scream or slam his fist on the table. The reaction was quieter, colder, the kind of silence that made everyone in the room shift slightly in their seats. Because the job had gone perfectly, and perfection was sacred. Frenchy was present during those early conversations. He watched how the air changed, how the confidence that had carried them through the robbery thinned into something sharper. Burke asked direct questions. Who saw it? How long was it there? Who knew about the location? The van wasn't just evidence. It was a symbol of carelessness. And carelessness could spread. Stacks had also violated the cardinal rule. No spending. No sudden lifestyle changes. Yet there were reports of him flashing money, talking loosely, acting like the score was already safe. To Burke, that combination was intolerable. Frenchy understood the logic, even if logic did not soften the consequences. In that life, tasks are not suggestions. They are obligations. When someone fails an obligation connected to millions of dollars, trust evaporates quickly. Stacks was not volatile like Tommy DeSimone. He was not deeply embedded in the strategic core like Frenchy. He was useful. He had been reliable in smaller roles. But usefulness is conditional. The decision formed quickly. It was not emotional revenge. It was containment. Stacks was summoned under the guise of a casual meeting. There was no warning, no grand confrontation, just an invitation that seemed routine. In the version most people remember, Tommy pulled the trigger, and that image fits the narrative of Tommy's explosive personality. But violence in that crew was rarely spontaneous. It was authorized, structured. Frenchy was not the man delivering the theatrical threat, but he was close enough to understand that the decision had already been made before Stacks walked into the room. The night unfolded without spectacle. Stacks arrived expecting conversation. Instead, he was met with finality. There are moments in organized crime where the gap between camaraderie and consequence becomes brutally clear. Stacks likely sensed something in the air, a slight shift in posture, a lack of usual banter. Perhaps he felt the weight of silence before he fully understood it. But realization does not alter momentum once it has begun. The gunshot ended the conversation permanently. Afterward, there was no celebration, no raised voices, just movement. Bodies had to be handled, scenes cleaned, alibis reinforced. The machine continued operating. Frenchy participated in what came next, not necessarily in the act itself, but in the aftermath, ensuring that nothing about the elimination created new vulnerabilities. Checking timelines, confirming who had seen Stacks last, anticipating how law enforcement might interpret his disappearance. He approached it the same way he approached the heist itself, as a problem to be stabilized. Stacks' murder served a purpose. It reinforced the rule. It reminded everyone that discipline was not optional, but it also deepened the paranoia. Because once one man is removed, others begin measuring their own position. Who is next? That question never needed to be spoken aloud. It lived in glances, in shortened conversations, in the way laughter became less frequent. Frenchy noticed those shifts. He did not react outwardly, but internally, he recalibrated. The purge had begun, and purge logic does not stop easily. The van's discovery was only the first fracture. Law enforcement intensified its investigation. Agents followed financial trails, interviewed associates, pieced together fragments. Each interview increased the perceived risk inside the crew. Burke's paranoia sharpened further. Stacks had been the first post-heist casualty. He would not be the last. Frenchy understood that Stacks' elimination was not purely about the van. It was about example, about resetting expectations, about ensuring that everyone still standing understood the stakes. Money amplifies behavior. Stacks had allowed the money to alter his behavior too quickly. That shift was fatal. The crew began operating under an unspoken principle. Invisibility equals survival. Frenchy embodied that principle. He did not question the decision. He did not debate morality. He assessed impact. Would Stacks have cracked under pressure? Possibly. Would his spending have drawn attention? Likely. From Burke's perspective, the calculus was simple. Remove uncertainty. For Frenchy, the lesson was also simple. Stay disciplined. Because in a climate where even small deviations could lead to elimination, proximity to power required flawless consistency. Stacks' death rippled outward. Friends noticed his absence. Family asked questions. Rumors spread. But within the inner circle, discussion was minimal. The message had been delivered, and it had been delivered early. That timing mattered, because the crew had not yet fully processed the psychological weight of the robbery. The murder forced them to confront it. This was no longer just a historic score. It was a turning point. Frenchy watched his trust between men thin slightly. Not broken, but altered. There is a subtle difference between camaraderie built on shared ambition and camaraderie tested by internal elimination. After Stacks, the latter dominated. Burke's trust in Frenchy deepened during this period. Not because Frenchy expressed approval, but because he remained stable. No visible discomfort, no gossip, no wavering loyalty. Burke needed men who could absorb difficult decisions without unraveling. Frenchy proved he could. The murder also signaled something larger. The Lufthansa job was no longer just about money. It was about control. Control of narrative. Control of exposure. Control of human variables. Stacks had become a variable, and variables were being erased. As the weeks progressed, law enforcement found the van and analyzed it. Fingerprints. Fibers. Anything that could connect suspects to the crime. Inside the crew, those developments were monitored carefully. Frenchy paid attention to every public announcement, every investigative update. He understood that each new detail could influence internal paranoia. And paranoia, once fed, becomes insatiable. Stacks' elimination did not reduce anxiety. It intensified it, because now the line had been crossed. Internal discipline was being enforced with lethal finality. The heist night had been precise and controlled. The aftermath was colder, more surgical. Frenchy stood in that cold space, not as a headline figure, not as a flamboyant enforcer, but as a stabilizing presence within escalating fear. He had watched a man walk into a room expecting conversation and leave it as a problem to be managed. He had seen how quickly alliances could shift from inclusion to elimination. He had absorbed the lesson without outward reaction. And as the purge widened in the coming weeks, as more names disappeared from the conversation entirely, the murder of Stacks would be remembered not as an isolated event, but as the moment when paranoia became policy. For Frenchy McMahon, it was also a confirmation. This was no longer just about executing plans. It was about surviving the consequences of success. And survival, in that environment, required more than competence. It required silence. Chapter 9. The Murder of Morrie Krugman. The phone kept ringing. Not once, not twice, but over and over, like a reminder that the job wasn't finished. Each call carried the same tone, impatient, irritated, increasingly desperate. Morrie Krugman wanted his money. He had helped facilitate the Lufthansa connection. He had introduced pieces of the puzzle. He believed that meant he was entitled to his full share without delay. And in his mind, delay looked like disrespect. But in Jimmy Burke's world, delay was strategy. The cash from Lufthansa had to move carefully, distributed in stages, filtered through safe hands, monitored for spending patterns. The last thing Burke needed was someone panicking publicly about a payout. Morrie was not muscle. He was not a core enforcer. He was a facilitator, a businessman with a taste for proximity to dangerous men. He enjoyed the feeling of being inside something big. He enjoyed telling people he was involved in important things. That appetite for attention now became a liability. Frenchy watched the shift unfold quietly. He had known Morrie for years. Everyone had. Morrie was loud in ways that made rooms uncomfortable. He talked too much, laughed too hard, repeated himself. When he wanted something, he didn't let it rest. After the robbery, that persistence hardened. He called Burke repeatedly, demanded answers, pressed for timelines, suggested he was being shortchanged. Each call added pressure, and pressure, in that atmosphere, was dangerous. The paranoia that began with the abandoned van had not subsided. It had intensified. Each deviation from discipline felt like a crack widening in the structure. Burke's patience with Morrie thinned. The conversations about him shifted tone. At first, they were irritated. He needs to calm down. Then they became analytical. Is he going to cause a problem? That was the real question. Frenchy was present during some of those discussions. He did not speak first. He rarely did. But when asked, he offered an honest assessment. Morrie was anxious. Morrie felt owed. Morrie was not wired for silence. That last trait mattered most. The FBI investigation was active. Interviews were ongoing. Financial scrutiny was intensifying. A man who felt cheated might rationalize cooperation as justice. Even if Morrie had no intention of flipping, his behavior suggested instability. And instability was contagious. Burke considered options. Pay him partially and by time? Risky. It might embolden further demands. Intimidate him? Possibly effective, but temporary. Remove him? Final. The logic narrowed quickly. Frenchy understood the pattern by now. Once a man's name began appearing repeatedly in paranoid conversations, the trajectory rarely reversed. Morrie continued pressing. In one recorded recollection, he was described as almost hysterical in tone, calling at inappropriate hours, raising his voice, questioning distribution. He underestimated the gravity of his position. He believed his relationship insulated him. But insulation thins when millions are at stake. The decision was made quietly. There would be no public argument, no drawn-out confrontation. Morrie would be invited to a meeting under the guise of resolution. The method mattered. You do not create spectacle when eliminating someone connected to a high-profile robbery. You create normalcy. Frenchy played a role in the logistics, not necessarily in pulling the trigger, but in ensuring that the meeting felt routine, that there were no unusual signals, that Morrie arrived without suspicion. There is a chilling simplicity to how such meetings are arranged. A casual call. Come by. We'll straighten this out. Morrie likely felt relief. Perhaps vindication. Perhaps he believed persistence had worked. But when he walked into that room, the temperature was different. The laughter was absent. The energy muted. He may have sensed it. People often do. But realization comes too late when momentum has already shifted. Accounts vary on the exact sequence of events inside that room. Some describe a sudden act. Others suggest a brief conversation before violence. What is consistent is the outcome. Morrie did not leave alive. For Frenchy, this was not an emotional eruption. It was continuation of a process that had begun with stacks. Containment. Afterward, the same ritual unfolded. Body disposal. Timeline management. Reinforcement of silence. But Morrie's death carried a different weight. Stacks had been a lower-level associate whose mistake endangered the operation. Morrie had been connected to the foundation of the robbery itself. Eliminating him signaled something deeper. No one was exempt from scrutiny, even those who facilitated the job. The crew absorbed that message quickly. Conversations shortened further. Men who might have once joked about their shares now avoided the topic entirely. Frenchy maintained his composure. He did not revel in Morrie's elimination. He did not question aloud. He treated it as structural necessity. But internally, The atmosphere was changing. With each removal, the circle tightened. And with a tighter circle comes heavier silence. Law enforcement noticed the pattern of disappearances. Journalists began speculating. The Lufthansa robbery was no longer just a story about a brilliant theft. It was becoming a story about vanishing men. The FBI intensified efforts to identify connections between the heist and the deaths. Frenchy monitored these developments carefully. He understood that each murder increased investigative interest. But from Burke's perspective, the alternative, leaving potential weak links alive, was worse. This is the cruel paradox of criminal paranoia. Each act intended to protect the operation also increases scrutiny. Morrie's death created ripples. He had family, friends, business associates. Questions arose. But in the absence of witnesses willing to speak, law enforcement struggled to build direct cases. The internal message was clear. Discipline is survival. Noise is fatal. Frenchy internalized that further. He adjusted his own interactions, reduced unnecessary meetings, avoided spaces where alcohol loosened tongues, maintained routines. He became even more invisible. Burke's trust in him remained intact, not because Frenchy expressed enthusiasm for the purge, but because he did not resist it. Resistance would have been noted, and noted resistance becomes suspicion. The elimination of Morrie marked a turning point. The crew was no longer merely defending against external threats. It was reshaping itself from within. Those who remained were either deeply trusted or exceptionally disciplined. Frenchy was both. The emotional toll of such decisions rarely surfaces publicly, but exists. Each removal creates distance between men, even trusted ones. Frenchy understood that proximity to power meant proximity to hard decisions. He had chosen this lane, not the charismatic one, not the volatile one, the quiet, operational one, and that lane now required steadiness more than ever. As weeks passed, and the list of names connected to Lufthansa shortened further, the pattern solidified. Success had birthed paranoia. Paranoia had birthed elimination. And elimination had redefined the crew. For outsiders, the robbery remained the headline. For insiders, the murders were the true story. Morrie's repeated phone calls had been a nuisance. His death was a warning. For Frenchy McMahon, it was another confirmation that the rules had shifted permanently. The job was never just about stealing money. It was about surviving what came after. And survival, in this phase, required absolute alignment with a leader whose fear had become policy. The purge was not over. And as more names hovered on the edge of conversation, one unspoken reality hung over every room. In a world where trust is conditional and silence is currency, the line between trusted enforcer and expendable associate is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Chapter 10. The Disappearances, Sepe, Cafora, and Others. By the time Angelo Sepe vanished, the pattern was no longer subtle. It didn't need to be explained. It didn't need to be announced. It was felt. In the way conversations ended mid-sentence. In the way chairs scraped back from tables a little more cautiously. In the way certain names simply stopped being spoken aloud. The Lufthansa robbery had begun as a triumph. A clean operation. A near-perfect execution. But what followed was not triumph. It was subtraction. Stacks had been the first warning. Morrie the second. By the time Sepe disappeared, everyone inside the circle understood that this was no longer about isolated mistakes. This was structural. Angelo Sepe had been around Burke for years. Quiet. Reliable. A man who did not demand attention, but commanded a kind of understated respect. He had participated in the Lufthansa job. He had taken his role seriously. He had not flaunted money recklessly. And yet, in the weeks following Morrie's murder, whispers began circulating that Sepe might be vulnerable. Not reckless, not disloyal, just vulnerable. Vulnerability, in that climate, was enough. Law enforcement pressure was intensifying. Agents were building profiles, interviewing associates, watching financial movements. The more bodies connected to Lufthansa surfaced, the more heat accumulated. Burke's paranoia was no longer a simmer. It was constant. He began evaluating not just behavior, but possibility. Could Sepe withstand interrogation? Could he endure isolation? Could he handle psychological pressure if brought into a room with federal agents determined to unravel the case? Frenchy sat in on some of those assessments. He did not push for elimination. He did not advocate mercy. He offered evaluations based on observed temperament. Sepe was steady, yes, but steady does not mean unbreakable. The calculus was brutal. Better to remove a potential weak link before it becomes an actual one. Sepe was called to a meeting under ordinary pretenses. Routine conversation. Nothing dramatic. He never returned home. His body was later found in a car, murdered and left as another quiet punctuation mark in the aftermath of Lufthansa. For those inside the crew, the message deepened. No one was immune, not even those who had remained disciplined. Louis Cafora followed. Cafora had been part of the crew's operations for years. He was involved in the robbery. He understood the stakes, but there were murmurs that he might have been talking loosely, not necessarily to authorities, but enough to create discomfort. In a paranoid system, discomfort is intolerable. Cafora's disappearance mirrored Sepe's in tone. Quiet, sudden, explained vaguely. Frenchy watched these eliminations not as isolated events, but as stages in a tightening spiral. Each removal served two purposes. First, eliminate potential exposure. Second, reinforce obedience. After Sepe and Cafora, the crew operated under an unspoken understanding. Any deviation, any perceived weakness, any hint of instability could be fatal. The inner circle grew smaller. Meetings were fewer. Trust became heavier, more burdensome. Frenchy remained inside that narrowing circle, not because he was louder than the others, not because he was more feared, but because he had maintained absolute consistency. No flashy purchases, no careless words, no emotional outbursts. He did not appear rattled by the disappearances. Outwardly, he was the same man he had been before the robbery. That steadiness insulated him, but it also tethered him to decisions that were becoming darker. The FBI was not blind to the pattern. Investigators recognized that individuals connected to the heist were vanishing. But recognition does not equal proof. Without witnesses willing to speak, without physical evidence directly linking Burke or others to the murders, the case remained fragmented. From Burke's perspective, the purge was working. Each potential liability removed reduced the probability of betrayal. But probability is not certainty. And paranoia, once embedded, does not retreat easily. There were others beyond Sepe and Cafora whose names surfaced in tense conversations. Men loosely connected, men who had peripheral knowledge, men who might have heard something, seen something, guessed something. The list was reviewed repeatedly. Frenchy understood that proximity to these discussions required composure. If he showed discomfort, it could be interpreted as dissent. If he showed enthusiasm, it would alter his carefully constructed persona. He chose neutrality. In that life, neutrality is not indifference. It is survival. Each disappearance created ripples beyond the crew. Families asked questions. Friends speculated. Rumors circulated in bars and social clubs. But without clear evidence, speculation remained noise. The underworld absorbed the pattern with quiet acknowledgement. The Lufthansa job had not just created wealth. It had created ghosts. Frenchy internalized a crucial lesson during this phase. The robbery itself had required planning and discipline. The aftermath required emotional control. Men who reacted visibly to the purge were noticed. Men who adapted silently endured. He adapted. He reduced unnecessary movement, maintained predictable routines, spoke less, observed more. Burke's reliance on him deepened, not because Frenchy was driving the purge, but because he was not destabilized by it. Burke needed at least one man near him who was not visibly fraying. Paranoia can consume leaders. Having a steady presence nearby reinforces confidence. Frenchy became that presence. The disappearances reshaped the crew's internal hierarchy. Those who remained were either deeply trusted or so peripheral that they posed no threat. The middle layer, the men with enough knowledge to matter but not enough insulation to be safe, was thinning rapidly. Frenchy had always operated slightly above that middle layer. His proximity to Burke placed him in a category that was both privileged and perilous. Privileged because he was trusted. Perilous because if trust shifted, the fall would be immediate. The emotional weight of the purge was not publicly acknowledged, but it lingered. Even men accustomed to violence felt the atmosphere shift. There is a difference between killing during execution and killing during consolidation. The first feels tactical. The second feels personal. Sepe and Cafora had not made overt mistakes like Stacks. Their eliminations signaled that the threshold for risk had lowered dramatically. Frenchy recognized that this phase would not last indefinitely. Paranoia burns intensely, but it also consumes energy. Eventually, either law enforcement would close in or the internal circle would stabilize. But until that stabilization occurred, every meeting carried undertones of evaluation. Every silence was loaded. Every absence noticed. The crew was no longer simply a criminal enterprise. It was a pressure chamber. Frenchy maintained equilibrium within it. He did not speculate aloud about who might be next. He did not question Burke's decisions. He understood that leadership under pressure can become unpredictable. His role was not to challenge. It was to steady. By the end of 1979, the Lufthansa Circle was a fraction of what it had been. The robbery had elevated them into history. The purge had reduced them into a smaller, colder unit. For Frenchy, survival during this phase reinforced his position. He had not cracked. He had not wavered. He had not drawn attention. But he also understood something deeper. The more the crew shrank, the more scrutiny focused on those who remained. And those who remained were now the most exposed. The disappearances had temporarily protected the operation, but they had also concentrated risk. Frenchy could sense that this was not the end of the story. The purge had quieted internal threats. It had not eliminated external ones. Law enforcement continued building cases. Witnesses, though scarce, were not non-existent. Time was moving forward, and with each passing month, the distance between the robbery and its consequences narrowed. The crew had survived its own paranoia. But survival in organized crime is always temporary. For Frenchy McMahon, the quiet man who had navigated execution and purge alike, the next phase would not be about eliminating others. It would be about whether his own silence could outlast the system closing in from the outside. Because eventually, paranoia inside a crew gives way to pressure from beyond it. And that pressure does not disappear quietly. Chapter 11. Why Burke Trusted Frenchy. Trust in that world was not sentimental. It wasn't built on shared childhood memories or drunken promises at a bar. It wasn't about who laughed the loudest or who had known whom the longest. Trust was built on pressure, on observation, on years of watching how a man behaves when the walls begin to close in. By the time the Lufthansa fallout had thinned the crew to a hardened core, Jimmy Burke had lost faith in many men. Some were dead. Some had vanished. Some had revealed cracks in ways both obvious and subtle. Frenchy McMahon was still there, still steady, still invisible in all the ways that mattered. Burke did not trust easily. His entire life had taught him that loyalty in organized crime is conditional. Money shifts allegiance. Fear exposes weakness. Ego invites betrayal. And yet, through the heist and the purge, Frenchy had remained constant. It wasn't one dramatic act that earned Burke's trust. It was accumulation. Years of small, disciplined decisions. Years of never needing to be corrected publicly. Years of not drawing attention unnecessarily. Trust, in Burke's mind, was like a ledger. Every reckless word, every impulsive move, every emotional outburst created a deficit. Frenchy's ledger showed no deficit. He did not brag about proximity to power. He did not use Burke's name to elevate himself socially. He did not talk loosely in bars or boast about inside knowledge. He understood that power was not something to flaunt. It was something to carry quietly. Burke respected that. In the aftermath of Lufthansa, when paranoia devoured much of the crew's internal stability, Burke began measuring men not by how loudly they proclaimed loyalty, but but by how little they demanded reassurance. Frenchy demanded nothing. He did not ask, "Am I safe?" He did not ask, "What's happening next?" He waited. He executed. He remained aligned. That alignment mattered. There were nights when Burke replayed conversations in his head, reassessed body language, wondered whether someone had shifted tone, whether someone's eyes had lingered too long on an exit during a meeting. Frenchy's eyes never betrayed that kind of restlessness. He was present, but not anxious. That composure created a psychological anchor. Paranoid leaders seek anchors. They need at least one figure who does not amplify their fear. Frenchy was that figure. He did not dismiss Burke's concerns. He did not feed them unnecessarily. He absorbed them. In discussions about potential weak links, Frenchy offered measured evaluations, not exaggerated condemnations, not defensive reassurances. When Burke asked, "You think he'll hold up?" Frenchy did not answer with certainty. Certainty is naive. He answered with probability. He's solid, but under real pressure, hard to say. That kind of honesty reinforced trust, because false guarantees are dangerous. Burke also valued something else in Frenchy: distance from chaos. Tommy DeSimone was volatile. Charismatic, yes. Fearless, yes. But unpredictable. Tommy could escalate situations unnecessarily. He could turn minor conflicts into irreversible outcomes. Henry Hill was sociable, useful, connected, but his personality thrived on movement, on interaction, on nightlife. That lifestyle carried exposure. Frenchy was different. He did not crave social space. He did not seek admiration. He operated in quieter corridors. That reduced exposure. Reduced exposure reduces risk. Burke's trust in Frenchy deepened not only because of what Frenchy did, but because of what he did not do. He did not spend recklessly after Lufthansa. He did not draw FBI attention through visible lifestyle changes. He did not insert himself into conversations unnecessarily. He understood compartmentalization. In organized crime, compartmentalization is survival. Think of it like fireproof doors in a building. If one room ignites, the doors prevent flames from spreading. Frenchy was a fireproof door. He did not allow emotional contagion to pass through him. Even during the purge, when Sepe and Cafora disappeared, when the atmosphere thickened with suspicion, Frenchy did not panic outwardly. He adapted. Burke noticed. Adaptation without complaint is rare. Many men grumble privately when pressure intensifies. They question decisions. They express frustration. Those murmurs travel. Frenchy's silence did not travel. It stayed contained. There were moments, subtle ones, when Burke tested him. Small pieces of information shared selectively to see if they resurfaced elsewhere. They did not. Small shifts in tone during meetings to gauge reaction. Frenchy did not overreact. Trust solidified through repetition. Burke also trusted Frenchy with sensitive logistical tasks. After the murders connected to Lufthansa, coordination required precision. Timelines needed to align. Stories needed to remain consistent. Frenchy handled those details without visible strain. He did not overcomplicate. He did not dramatize. He treated them as operational necessities. That professionalism mattered. Burke's fear was not just of law enforcement. It was of internal betrayal. The idea that someone he had elevated might flip under pressure haunted him. Frenchy's personality profile suggested low probability of flipping. He was not motivated by attention. He was not driven by ego. He did not seem resentful. Resentment often precedes betrayal. Frenchy showed none. He did not complain about distribution of money. He did not argue over hierarchy. He accepted his position without agitation. In criminal organizations, agitation signals dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction breeds unpredictability. Frenchy's lack of agitation reinforced stability. Burke's trust was also pragmatic. He needed someone close who could function as an extension of his will without needing constant oversight. Frenchy was capable of independent execution. If Burke instructed him to handle a problem, he did not require detailed micromanagement. He understood context. He understood tone. He understood urgency. That autonomy is rare. It requires alignment not just with instructions, but with philosophy. Frenchy aligned with Burke's philosophy of controlled force and disciplined silence. Over time, this alignment evolved into something approaching reliance. Burke leaned on Frenchy during tense periods. Not emotionally, operationally. When rumors surfaced about potential informants, Frenchy helped evaluate credibility. When law enforcement actions intensified, Frenchy assisted in assessing exposure. He was not the face of decisions. He was the stabilizer behind them. Trust in organized crime is also built on shared risk. Frenchy had participated in high-stakes operations for years. He had risked his freedom repeatedly. That shared exposure created mutual vulnerability. Mutual vulnerability reinforces trust. Burke knew that Frenchy had as much to lose as he did. Shared stakes bind men together. Unlike peripheral associates who could potentially negotiate lesser charges by cooperating, Frenchy's involvement in serious operations made flipping a catastrophic gamble. Burke calculated that too. Trust is rarely pure. It is strategic. But over years, strategy becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes confidence. By the early 1980s, as the Lufthansa fallout settled into a colder phase, Burke's inner circle was leaner than ever. Frenchy remained, not by accident, not by luck, but by design. His discipline, invisibility, and emotional control had insulated him. He had never needed to prove himself loudly. He had proven himself quietly. There is a kind of loyalty that is expressed through action rather than speech. Frenchy embodied that. He did not declare allegiance. He demonstrated it. For Burke, that was enough. But trust, even deep trust, does not eliminate risk. It reduces it. And as law enforcement pressure slowly mounted in ways that internal purges could not address, Burke would soon face a new kind of test. Not about who inside the crew might crack, but about who outside the crew was closing in. Frenchy's silence had protected him through paranoia. Whether it would protect him through prosecution was a different question. Because trust inside a crew means little when the federal system begins building cases from the outside. And even the most trusted enforcer can find himself standing alone when the circle tightens from a direction he cannot control. Chapter 12. Henry Hill didn't know everything. There is a moment in every story where the narrator becomes the filter. And filters are dangerous, because what they show feels complete. What they omit disappears. When people think about the Lufthansa heist, they see it through Henry Hill's eyes. His voice guides the memory. His charisma carries the weight of the narrative. His rise, his fall, his paranoia, his eventual cooperation with the government. It all feels central. But being central to a story does not mean you were central to every decision. Henry Hill lived in motion. He thrived in restaurants, nightclubs, social circles. He was the connector, the facilitator, the man who could float between worlds. He could speak to airport employees with ease, charm bartenders, cultivate relationships that others might fumble. His skill set was invaluable in gathering information and smoothing logistics. But the deeper the stakes grew, the narrower the rooms became. And not everyone was invited inside those rooms. After Lufthansa, when paranoia took hold and elimination became policy, the inner circle shifted. Henry was still close to Burke, but he was not the only axis of gravity. His strength had always been movement, and movement can look like exposure when scrutiny intensifies. Frenchy operated differently. He did not move socially with the same frequency. He did not cultivate wide networks. He did not enjoy the spotlight. He stayed in lanes that were narrower, quieter, more insulated. That insulation meant that certain conversations happened outside Henry's presence. When viewers watch Goodfellas, they see Henry narrate the purge. They see him describe who got killed, who disappeared, who violated Burke's rules. It feels like he knew everything. But that knowledge was observational, not comprehensive. Henry saw effects. He did not necessarily sit through every cause. The meetings where names were evaluated, where probabilities were weighed, where elimination was framed as containment. Those meetings were not always populated by the most charismatic figures. They were populated by the most trusted. Frenchy's absence from Henry's narration is not accidental. It is structural. Henry was not in every room. And Frenchy, by design, did not seek rooms that required narrative. He sought rooms that required silence. When Morrie Krugman pressed for a share, Henry felt the irritation. He witnessed the tension. But the final decision-making layer, the exact tone of those deliberations, was likely narrower. When Sepe and Cafora disappeared, Henry understood the pattern. But understanding the pattern does not equate to authorizing it. Frenchy was closer to authorization, not as the originator of decisions, but as the stabilizer within them. Henry's world began fracturing in the early 1980s as drug involvement complicated his life. His use escalated. His behavior grew erratic. That volatility distanced him from the most sensitive operational discussions. Burke tolerated Henry for years because of loyalty and usefulness. But usefulness shifts under scrutiny. Frenchy's usefulness remained consistent. He did not introduce new variables. He did not bring drug exposure into the core. He did not draw unpredictable law enforcement attention through visible chaos. Henry's eventual cooperation with federal authorities reinforced something important about information asymmetry. When he began describing the crew's operations to prosecutors, he spoke from his vantage point. He recounted what he saw, what he experienced, what he knew, but he did not know everything. There were compartments within compartments. Compartmentalization is the backbone of organized crime. It ensures that if one man flips, he cannot collapse the entire structure. Henry's knowledge was deep in some areas, especially social connections and visible operations. But the quieter enforcement layer, the one that included men like Frenchy, operated partially outside his daily awareness. This explains something subtle about Frenchy's relative invisibility in cinematic retellings. He was not absent. He was adjacent to decisions that Henry may have inferred, but did not always witness directly. There is a difference between knowing a man is dead and knowing exactly who authorized it. Henry could narrate the pattern. He could describe the mood. He could recount conversations he was part of. But he was not always the man sitting across from Burke when paranoia crystallized into decision. Frenchy often was. This does not mean Henry was peripheral. It means the structure was layered. Think of it like concentric circles. Henry occupied an outer-inner circle, close, trusted, present in many operations. Frenchy occupied an inner circle, smaller, quieter, closer to final authorization. When Henry began spiraling under drug pressure, that layering became even more pronounced. His arrest on narcotics charges in 1980 and subsequent paranoia about being killed altered his alignment. He began looking over his shoulder. He began suspecting that he might be next in the purge. That fear was not unfounded, but it also demonstrates the gap in perspective. Henry believed he understood the full scope of Burke's calculus. In reality, there were conversations he was not part of. Frenchy's silence preserved that gap. He did not correct Henry publicly. He did not reveal internal deliberations. He did not broadcast his proximity. So when the story was eventually told from Henry's vantage point, Frenchy remained a figure in the background, present, but not illuminated. And Hollywood, by its nature, simplifies structures. It needs a focal lens. Henry provided that lens. Frenchy did not. His personality resisted it. He was not flamboyant. He did not offer quotable lines. He did not seek narrative ownership. He operated in a lane that does not translate easily into cinematic arcs. The enforcement stabilizer, the quiet executor, the man who does not narrate. Henry's cooperation also reveals something critical about how information fractures in criminal cases. When one insider flips, law enforcement builds cases based on that insider's knowledge. But if that knowledge is compartmentalized, certain figures remain less exposed. Frenchy's lower profile and Henry's testimony did not necessarily mean he was less involved. It meant he was less visible from Henry's perspective. And perspective shapes history. In interviews years later, when Henry recounted the Lufthansa fallout, he emphasized Tommy's volatility, Burke's paranoia, his own fear. Frenchy appeared briefly, as muscle, as presence. But the subtler operational layer remained largely unspoken. Partly because Henry did not sit in every room. Partly because Frenchy's lane was built on invisibility. The irony is stark. The man most trusted during the purge became the man least dramatized in retellings. Because drama gravitates toward volatility. And Frenchy was the opposite of volatile. Henry's narrative arc, rise, fall, cooperation, makes for compelling storytelling. Frenchy's arc, steady, silent, insulated, resists it. But for those examining the structure of the crew historically, that silence speaks volumes. It suggests a stratified organization where knowledge was distributed unevenly, where charisma did not equal control, where the most dangerous men were often the least theatrical. Henry Hill's story shaped public understanding of Lufthansa, but it did not capture every dimension. Frenchy's absence from the spotlight is not evidence of insignificance. It is evidence of function. He functioned in a space designed to remain unseen. And when law enforcement eventually built conspiracy cases related to Lufthansa, that structural invisibility influenced outcomes. Henry could describe certain meetings. He could outline timelines. But he could not narrate conversations he never attended. That gap preserved some men longer than others. As the federal net slowly tightened in the early 1980s, the asymmetry of knowledge would matter. Because what prosecutors can prove depends heavily on what insiders can articulate. And when the most silent enforcer is also the least narrated, the path to conviction becomes more complex. Frenchy's story exists partly in those gaps, in the spaces between Henry's recollections, in the rooms not captured by camera or memoir. And understanding those gaps is essential to understanding why the public version of events differs from the structural reality inside the crew. Henry told his truth, but his truth was not the entire map. And for Frenchy McMahon, operating in that uncharted territory was not accidental. It was intentional, because in organized crime, the safest position is often just outside the narrator's frame, until the system from outside begins building its own narrative. One based not on perspective, but on evidence. And when that evidence begins to accumulate, even the quietest man can find his invisibility tested in ways he never anticipated. Chapter 13, The Arrests and Federal Case. The knock never sounds dramatic in real life. It's not thunderous. It doesn't splinter wood. It's controlled, deliberate. The kind of knock that announces authority without needing to shout it. And when it finally came for the Lufthansa crew, it did not arrive all at once. It arrived in waves. Subpoenas, indictments, quiet pickups that signaled the long arm of federal investigation had finally gathered enough pieces to move. By the early 1980s, the immediate frenzy surrounding the robbery had cooled publicly. The headlines were no longer daily. The press had shifted attention to newer crises. But inside federal offices, the file never closed. Agents had been patient. They tracked financial trails. They studied known associates. They revisited the abandoned van. They mapped connections between the disappeared men and those still standing. And they waited. Time is a weapon in federal investigations. Criminal crews often rely on speed, on the idea that if they can survive the first months after a crime, they can outlast attention. But federal prosecutors build cases like architects, slowly, carefully, reinforcing weak points before unveiling the structure. Frenchy understood this instinctively. He had maintained discipline. He had avoided sudden wealth displays. He had reduced exposure. But discipline does not erase history. The Lufthansa case was too large to disappear. Grand juries were convened. Witnesses were called. Financial records were subpoenaed. The conspiracy net widened. When arrests began, they were not always directly tied to Lufthansa alone. Charges ranged across racketeering, hijackings, gambling, and other operations that had accumulated over years. Federal prosecutors understood leverage. Sometimes you do not charge a man solely for the most famous crime. You charge him for what you can prove, then build pressure. Jimmy Burke was eventually arrested and later convicted on other charges. His empire, once held together by paranoia and control, began fracturing under federal scrutiny. Frenchy's moment came within that broader sweep. He was indicted in connection with the Lufthansa conspiracy. The charges did not rely solely on dramatic eyewitness testimony. They were built from a mosaic of evidence, associations, timelines, corroborations. The federal strategy was clear: break the crew through layered prosecutions. Henry Hill's cooperation provided context. He described structures, relationships, patterns. But as established, Henry did not know everything. His testimony illuminated some corridors while leaving others dim. For prosecutors, Frenchy represented a different type of defendant. Not flamboyant, not easily caricatured. He did not have the volatile aura of Tommy DeSimone, who by then was already dead. He did not have the dramatic arc of a cooperating witness. He was quiet, measured, harder to read. When agents arrived, they did not find a man panicking visibly. Frenchy did not resist theatrically. He understood that arrests were procedural. What mattered now was posture. Inside the federal system, posture can influence trajectory. Men who crumble immediately often give prosecutors more than intended. Men who posture aggressively can draw additional scrutiny. Men who remain composed project resilience. Frenchy chose composure. The federal case unfolded methodically. Courtrooms replaced backrooms. Indictments replaced whispered deliberations. Where Burke once evaluated men in private, now federal judges evaluated them publicly. The evidence tied Frenchy to the conspiracy: meetings, associations, roles within the crew. Prosecutors painted a picture of a disciplined enforcer operating close to the center of decision-making. Defense strategy relied on doubt. Compartmentalization works both ways. Just as it limited Henry's knowledge internally, it complicated prosecutors' ability to prove specific actions externally. Frenchy was not recorded bragging. He had not left flamboyant financial trails. He had not inserted himself into dramatic public moments. The case rested on connecting him to the planning and aftermath of the robbery through association and corroboration. Federal trials are less cinematic than films suggest. There are no sudden confessions under bright lights. There are documents, witnesses, cross-examinations, technical language that translates life-altering events into procedural arguments. Frenchy sat through it without spectacle. He did not become a headline personality. He did not lash out in court. He listened. For someone who had built his reputation on silence, the courtroom demanded a different kind of restraint. Words spoken there carry permanent weight. The prosecution emphasized the scale of Lufthansa. Over $5 million in cash and currency. The largest cash robbery in American history at the time. They outlined the structure of the crew. They described the purge that followed. They suggested that men like Frenchy were not peripheral muscle, but trusted operational figures within a conspiracy that had spiraled into violence. The defense countered with ambiguity. Association does not equal direct action. Presence in a crew does not equal authorization of every act. Compartmentalization creates gray zones. But gray zones shrink under federal racketeering statutes. The racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act allowed prosecutors to frame the crew as a criminal enterprise. Participation in that enterprise carried liability beyond individual acts. Frenchy's proximity to Burke became a focal point. Trust, once an asset internally, became a vulnerability externally. Prosecutors argued that trusted proximity implied deeper involvement. The jury deliberated. For men accustomed to controlling outcomes through force or fear, the courtroom is alien territory. There is no intimidation, no recalibration mid-decision. The verdict emerges from strangers who interpret facts through law. Frenchy was convicted for his role in the Lufthansa conspiracy. The sentence was not life, but it was substantial. Years behind bars. Years stripped of the invisibility he had cultivated. Prison alters hierarchies. On the street, Frenchy had operated in controlled rooms. Inside prison, control shifts to different dynamics. Reputation still matters. Composure still matters. But the system is rigid. He adapted there as he had adapted outside. He did not become loud. He did not seek notoriety among inmates. He maintained discipline. The irony of his arrest is layered. He survived the purge. He outlasted internal paranoia. He remained trusted through the most volatile phase of the crew's history. But federal patience eventually accomplished what internal fear could not. It removed him from the street. Burke would eventually receive a life sentence on unrelated charges and die in prison. Henry Hill entered witness protection, his life fractured and rebuilt under a different identity. Frenchy's path diverged again. He served his time. He did not flip. He did not become a cooperating star witness. His silence, consistent with his persona, persisted. The federal case demonstrated something fundamental about organized crime. Internal discipline can protect against some threats. It cannot neutralize systemic prosecution indefinitely. For Frenchy, the arrest was not theatrical downfall. It was procedural consequence. He faced it without spectacle. And in doing so, he reinforced the same trait that had defined his rise within the crew: control. The Lufthansa robbery had elevated him into proximity with history. The federal case anchored him in consequence. Years passed inside prison walls. The noise of the robbery faded from daily headlines. But its impact lingered in legal records, in criminal lore, in the narratives told by those who cooperated. Frenchy's narrative remained quieter, less dramatized, less sensational, but structurally significant. He had been part of the core. He had navigated paranoia. He had survived internal elimination. And when the federal system moved, he absorbed the outcome without betrayal. The man Henry Hill barely narrated had now been judged in a courtroom rather than a backroom. And unlike others who reshaped their stories publicly, Frenchy allowed his to remain largely unwritten. Until now. Because understanding the federal case is not about sensational courtroom theatrics. It is about recognizing that even the most disciplined enforcer eventually meets a system that does not negotiate through fear. And when that system closes in, silence becomes both shield and burden. Frenchy carried both. And when his sentence ended, when prison gates eventually opened, he would step into a world transformed by time. But whether that world still had space for a man built on invisibility was another question entirely. Chapter 14. Life After Prison. When the gate finally opened, there was no crowd waiting. No cameras. No celebration. No whispered reunions in back rooms thick with smoke. Just a man stepping from one controlled environment into another kind of uncertainty. Prison strips away mythology. It reduces men to routines, to numbers, to schedules dictated by others. For years, Thomas Frenchy McMahon had lived inside walls that did not care about Lufthansa, about Burke, about internal purges, or the way to silence. Inside, the only currency that mattered was composure. He had carried that composure with him. Now, stepping back into the outside world, he carried something else: time. Time lost. Time shifted. Time that had altered the streets he once navigated. New York in the early 1980s was not the New York he had entered in the 60s. The city had changed. Crime structures had evolved. Federal enforcement had grown more aggressive. The romanticized era of hijackings and loosely connected crews had hardened into a more surveilled landscape. Frenchy did not step back into a vacuum. He stepped into a world that had moved on. Jimmy Burke was serving life. His authority, once so absolute within that crew, now existed only in prison corridors and fading recollections. Henry Hill was in witness protection, living under a different name, narrating fragments of a past that no longer belonged to him fully. The crew that had once felt indestructible was scattered, some dead, some imprisoned, some vanished. For Frenchy, reintegration required recalibration. He had never been the public face of anything. That invisibility now worked in his favor. Unlike men whose notoriety followed them loudly, Frenchy's name did not echo through headlines daily. He had been convicted, yes. His role documented in court records. But he was not a household name. He preferred it that way. Life after prison for organized crime figures often splits into two paths. Some attempt to re-enter old networks, believing familiarity will insulate them. Others withdraw, recognizing that the landscape has shifted too dramatically to risk exposure. Frenchy chose distance. Not dramatic exile, but measured distance. He understood that federal scrutiny does not evaporate overnight. Associations linger in files. Informants remain active. The FBI never fully erases names connected to major cases. Resuming visible criminal activity would have been reckless. Recklessness had never defined him. He moved quietly, reconnected with family, maintained routines, avoided flamboyant gatherings. He did not grant interviews. He did not publish memoirs. He did not seek to correct Henry Hill's narrative publicly. Silence, once operational, became personal. There is a peculiar weight that comes with surviving both internal purge and federal prosecution. It forces introspection, not necessarily moral reckoning. That is a separate process, but reckoning with structure. The structure that had elevated him no longer existed in the same form. Burke's empire was gone. The Lufthansa story had become legend, and legends distort. They simplified complex hierarchies into caricatures. Frenchy remained a footnote in most retellings. That invisibility could have bred resentment. But resentment was not his style. He had never sought centrality. He had sought stability. In prison, he had adapted to hierarchy within walls. Outside, he adapted again. He did not attempt to reclaim authority. He did not position himself as an elder statesman of organized crime. He reduced his footprint. The discipline that had preserved him during paranoia and now preserved him in freedom. The streets he once navigated with confidence were more surveilled. Technology had advanced. Financial tracking was more sophisticated. Informant programs more structured. The old model of hijacking and redistribution had diminished under heavier law enforcement pressure. Frenchy recognized this intuitively. Adaptation meant recognizing that certain eras do not return. He aged into a quieter phase. Men who once commanded rooms eventually become observers. He likely watched news reports about crime differently now. He had seen the inside of federal courtrooms. He had experienced the rigidity of prison systems. Romanticism fades when confronted with institutional reality. Yet, he did not publicly renounce his past. He did not seek redemption narratives. He maintained distance from spectacle. That consistency is striking. Many former associates of major criminal enterprises eventually gravitate toward media, interviews, documentaries, tell-all books. They reshape their image. Frenchy did not. Perhaps because his identity had never depended on image. It had depended on function. And outside the structure of Burke's crew, that function no longer existed in the same way. He lived, quietly, a man once trusted with millions, once present in rooms where life and death were calculated, now operating in a world that rarely acknowledged that proximity. There is a psychological shift that accompanies that transition. When you have lived in high-stakes environments, ordinary life can feel muted. But for someone who valued steadiness over adrenaline, perhaps that muting felt appropriate. Time moved forward. The Lufthansa robbery remained an anchor in criminal history. Documentaries emerged. Books were written. Films were produced. Frenchy's presence in those retellings remained marginal. He appeared briefly in Goodfellas. A background figure. No grand monologue. No central arc. Viewers assumed he was muscle. They did not see the years of accumulated trust that placed him in Burke's inner orbit. They did not see the rooms where decisions were weighed. They saw a silhouette. That silhouette followed him in public memory. But in private, he lived outside it. He did not attempt to reclaim narrative ownership. Perhaps he understood something fundamental about stories. They simplify. Reality rarely fits clean arcs. His reality was layered. He had risen through discipline, survived through silence, fallen through federal prosecution, re-emerged without spectacle. Life after prison is often portrayed as dramatic redemption or tragic relapse. For Frenchy, it appears to have been neither. It was continuation. Continuation of restraint. Continuation of invisibility. Continuation of the same behavioral patterns that had defined his rise. He avoided drugs. Avoided flamboyant gatherings. Avoided entanglement in new conspiracies that would attract attention. The city aged. So did he. Names once spoken daily in back rooms became historical references. Burke's life sentence cast a long shadow over anyone connected to his crew. Frenchy, having served his time, existed in that shadow without amplifying it. He did not publicly challenge Henry Hill's portrayal. He did not attempt to reshape the Lufthansa narrative. He allowed it to stand as told. That acceptance is telling, because it reinforces the core thesis of his life. He did not need visibility to feel secure. He needed stability. And stability, after prison, required distance. The irony is sharp. The man who survived the purge, who navigated paranoia, who remained trusted through the darkest phase of the crew, ultimately stepped into obscurity voluntarily. Not erased, but quiet. As years passed, younger generations encountered Lufthansa as legend. They debated details online, analyzed film scenes, quoted Henry's narration. Frenchy's name surfaced occasionally in deeper dives. Researchers noted his proximity, his conviction, his role, but for most, he remained peripheral, which may have been the only fitting outcome for a man who built his life on being present without being seen. Life after prison did not rewrite him. It confirmed him. The quiet enforcer became the quiet survivor. And as time continued its steady march, one question lingered beneath the surface of every retelling. If the movie showed only a glimpse, and Henry narrated only his vantage point, then who truly understood the man who operated just outside the spotlight? Because survival is not always the loudest legacy. Sometimes, it is simply the absence of noise. And in Frenchy McMahon's case, that absence might be the most revealing detail of all. Chapter 15. The man Hollywood almost erased. In the movie, he walks through the frame and disappears. No monologue, no dramatic close-up, no swelling music, just a presence, a face among faces, another guy in the crew, background muscle, the kind of character you register for a second and forget by the next scene. But that's the trick of cinema. It compresses hierarchies. It sharpens some figures and blurs others. It chooses who gets the voiceover and who becomes silhouette. Thomas Frenchy McMahon became silhouette. And in doing so, one of Jimmy Burke's most trusted enforcers was quietly flattened in a background scenery. But history is not filmed from one angle. When you pull back from Henry Hill's narration, when you step outside the frame of Goodfellas, a different structure emerges. A layered one, a colder one, a more disciplined one. And inside that structure, Frenchy was not an extra. He was ballast. He had been there before Lufthansa became legend, before the van was abandoned, before Stax was summoned, before Morrie's phone calls turned fatal, before Sepe and Cafora vanished into the winter air. He had built proximity the slow way, through reliability, through silence, through years of never being the loudest man in the room. Burke trusted volatility when it was useful. He tolerated charisma when it brought advantage. But what he relied on, especially when paranoia tightened its grip, was steadiness. Frenchy represented steadiness, and steadiness rarely gets screen time. Hollywood gravitates toward extremes. The charming narrator, the explosive psychopath, the glamorous downfall, the dramatic betrayal. It needs arcs, climaxes, emotional pivots. Frenchy did not pivot. He did not implode. He did not flip. He did not seek redemption under bright lights. He stayed aligned. He served his sentence. He walked back into the world without demanding the microphone. That kind of life does not fit cleanly into a 2-hour film, but it fits perfectly into the mechanics of organized crime. The reality of the Lufthansa crew was not built solely on flashy personalities. It was built on layered trust, on compartmentalization, on men who understood when to speak and when to remain silent. Henry Hill told his story from his vantage point, and his vantage point was powerful. It shaped public memory. It defined the emotional arc of the era. But it was partial, because no single man inside that crew saw everything. The rooms where the purge was finalized were smaller than the rooms where the heist was planned, and Frenchy occupied those smaller rooms. He was present when discipline hardened into elimination, when paranoia shifted from whisper to policy, when loyalty was measured not by declarations but by reaction. He did not dramatize those moments. He absorbed them, and absorption leaves fewer cinematic fingerprints. When Stax was killed, the image is Tommy pulling the trigger. When Morrie vanished, the focus rests on Burke's irritation. When Sepe and Cafora disappeared, the story becomes a list of casualties. Frenchy is often implied, but rarely centered. But implication can be more revealing than spotlight. Because implication suggests trust, Burke did not bring unreliable men into the deepest discussions. He did not lean on men who required reassurance. He leaned on Frenchy. That is not romantic. It is structural. The man Hollywood almost erased was one of the few who survived both internal purge and federal prosecution without reshaping his story for public consumption. There is something unsettling about that, because it suggests a personality comfortable with anonymity, comfortable with silence, comfortable with being the unseen weight that stabilizes a volatile leader. In a world where ego often fuels collapse, that absence of ego preserved him, not permanently, not from prison, but from the internal executions that claimed others. He did not crumble when fear spread. He did not overreact when bodies surfaced. He did not panic publicly when the FBI tightened its grip. He remained controlled, and control, more than violence, defined his influence. When federal prosecutors built their case, they framed him as part of the conspiracy, a trusted participant in a historic robbery, a stabilizing figure inside a criminal enterprise. They did not frame him as a headline personality, because he was not. Even in conviction, he remained understated. He did not become a star witness. He did not turn into a talk show guest. He served his time, and when he re-entered the world, he did so without spectacle. That consistency is the key to understanding him. He was not erased by accident. He was erased by design, his own design, because invisibility was not weakness. It was strategy. Invisibility kept him off the front page during the purge. It kept him from being overexposed in Henry's testimony. It kept him from becoming a caricature in cinematic retellings. The irony is profound. The very trait that preserved him also diminished his public legacy. The man who operated closest to Burke during the darkest phase of the Lufthansa aftermath became a footnote in the story most people know. But when you examine the structure carefully, the footnote expands. It reveals a pattern. Burke trusted him not because he was loud, not because he was feared theatrically, but because he was predictable under pressure. And predictability is the rarest commodity in organized crime. In the end, Frenchy's story is not one of flamboyant rise or dramatic betrayal. It is one of alignment. Alignment with a leader whose paranoia reshaped a crew. Alignment with discipline when money distorted judgment. Alignment with silence when others sought attention. He was not the narrator. He was not the cautionary tale. He was the stabilizer who endured. And perhaps that is why Hollywood almost erased him. Because endurance is quieter than collapse. But if you look closely at the architecture of the Lufthansa era, if you trace the lines of trust rather than the arcs of drama, you see him clearly, standing just behind the frame, present in the rooms that mattered, trusted when trust was scarce, silent when silence was survival. And in that silence lies the truest portrait of Thomas Frenchy McMahon, not a background extra, not a cinematic afterthought, but a disciplined enforcer who understood that in the American Mafia, the most powerful position is often the one that never demands to be seen. And as the credits roll on the version of history most people know, there he remains, in the shadows, exactly where he chose to stand.